A Sound in the Dark, Part 1, from Mr. Smith. This is a pretty long one, and it's been nearly a year since it happened, but I will do my best to recount every detail that I can remember. This is the story of the days and weeks leading up to a moonlit October night in the rural heartland of the southeastern US. But before I begin, there are a few things you should know. My family has owned a moderately sized farm in a very rural county for 6 generations, and we have all sorts of strange stories and family lore about the land. I'd love to share more, but for now I'll focus on this story. Just know that this farm has a history of peculiar happenings. My grandfather had passed away suddenly while I was completing my senior year of college, and my father had recently moved out of state for his job, taking my mother with him. This left me as the only immediate family member in any position to manage the land. So as soon as I finished my exams and made my proud walk across the stage for my diploma, I packed up all my belongings into the truck and headed home. I have to admit that it was pretty nice to be back in my old hometown, even though lots of little things had changed. However, by far the strangest thing I came back to was the old farm. Even though I had spent a huge portion of my childhood running around the orchards, swimming in the creek, and hunting deer and turkey in the woods and hayfields of that farm, I'd never actually lived there. So it felt strange indeed to be coming home to that house. Moving in was at least fairly easy, as the house was practically empty. There wasn't even a clock left on the wall or a single potted plant left on the porch. I might be easily spooked, but I have to admit, the emptiness made the place a little creepy, especially combined with the isolation. The driveway to get to the farmhouse is about half a mile long, and the nearest neighbors are close enough to hear a gunshot, but not close enough to hear a call for help. To make matters worse, apparently while I was away, a serious coyote population had moved into the area. On clear and calm evenings, I could hear at least 5 different packs of coyotes raising Cain all over the area. They're not usually a real threat to humans, but they can carry some nasty diseases, and their howling is certainly an eerie sound to hear on a dark and foggy night. Nevertheless, I have to admit that life was good. I'd gotten a job at a local machine shop that paid well enough to make ends meet, and also gave me a little bit of pocket money to spare. Meanwhile, I was using my free time and money to fix up the farm. I repaired fence lines, trimmed the long neglected orchards, and put up new tree stands at a few choice places around the property. I even rekindled a high school romance with a nice local girl who now owned her own business in town. Like I said, life was good. Things didn't start to get weird until around September, but boy, did they get weird real quick. It began one evening very early in September, which is still really summertime in my area. The sun had gone down, but it wasn't completely dark yet, and I had just finished picking the first autumn apples in one of the orchards. I was unpacking the baskets from the back of my truck, enjoying the coolness of the evening after the long, hot day, when I noticed an unfamiliar sound. What was strange about it was that I couldn't really tell you when it started, because it wasn't sudden or really even that noticeable. It's hard to describe, but I just gradually became aware that the evening wasn't as quiet as usual. And when I listened closely to it, I finally realized that there was a low, droning, and constant howl echoing across the landscape. Now, this wasn't the howl of a coyote or even a wolf. I've heard both of these before, and this was certainly something different. In fact, at first I didn't think it was an animal at all. It sounded more like the howl of wind through the old boards, or the sound that worn-out tires make when you go just the right speed on the interstate. I hadn't yet gotten around to hauling away some of the junk around the farmyard, so I figured that some old scrap must have been catching the wind just right to make the howl. perhaps a piece of tin roofing or some rusted out sheet metal. However, the noise continued to gradually grow louder, and that was when I noticed that there was no wind blowing at all, not even a slight breeze. At that point, I was beginning to feel uneasy, but still, there was nothing to be alarmed about, right? There wasn't any crashing footsteps or glowing red eyes staring out from the woods at me. I figured maybe it was the sound of some electric farm equipment on some of the neighbors' property. After all, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that some manufacturer makes an eco-friendly tractor that makes plenty of operating noise, but lacks the signature rumble of a diesel engine. By this point, I had finished unpacking my tools and the few buckets of apples from the truck, but the howling had actually become louder. It seemed to be coming from a stand of woods off to one side of the back fields, but it was hard to tell since all of the outbuildings have a tendency to bounce sound around quite a lot. Another thing that made the sound difficult to pin down was the low and constant nature of it. It was almost as though it simply hung in the air, rather than really coming from anywhere specific. I decided that I didn't really like trudging through the woods with a flashlight and a shotgun, and I figured that the truth would probably come out in the morning light. So I simply pulled my truck into the garage and headed inside. Nothing else happened that evening, but once I got inside the house, it finally hit me just how loud the howl had gotten. When I stepped inside and shut the door, my ears were ringing. The soft silence of the farmhouse seemed profound by comparison. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed the howling a few more times, but I wasn't able to pin down any concrete pattern or cause and effect surrounding it. The one thing I noticed was that it always started at dusk, and it would usually happen after a night or two of intense coyote activity. The following day, the whole farm would be dead calm. I asked around with some of my neighbors, but none of them reported experiencing anything like what I described. Naturally, this was quite a concern to me, and I began to wonder, might I be developing hearing problems or something like that? Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, this proved not to be the case. One night in late September, a friend of mine from college was passing through on his way to visit some family, so I let him crash at the farm with me for the night. I heard him coming up the long gravel driveway just past sundown, and I headed out onto the front porch to meet him. As soon as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I noticed that the sourceless howling was rolling over the fields that night, but I decided to just ignore it for the sake of my friend. However, as soon as he got out of the car, his ears perked up, and he looked around suspiciously for a few moments. "You hear it too?" I asked him, suddenly relieved that I wasn't going crazy or developing tinnitus. "Yeah, what is that?" he asked nervously. I told him a few of my theories, but I confided in him that it was starting to spook me a bit, since it had been going on at random for nearly 4 weeks by now. We both eventually laughed about it, but we spent the rest of the evening indoors, except for the few times he went out onto the porch for a smoke. What's more, every time he would come back inside, he would shake his head and say, "I guess it's still out there," telling me that the howling has not stopped. After that night, the howling did not return for more than a week, and in the meantime, I busied myself with work at the machine shop. I was also putting all of my spare time into picking apples, plums, pears, pecans, and wild grapes. All the bounty of autumn, and a reward for a summer of hard work. Besides, it was hunting season, and it was high time to get back into the woods for a chance at a nice side of venison. Now, I'd been tracking a small herd of deer back and forth across the property for a few weeks, and I'd gotten nice and comfortable in my tree stand in the early evening. I was scanning the fields for any signs of movement when I heard a lone coyote start to howl not too far away. Soon enough, a whole group of them had taken to barking and howling, and they were close too. Their barks and yips drew closer and closer, coming from just beyond the tree line, about 400 yards ahead of me. I picked up my .35 caliber rifle, then looked through the scope. scanning the trees for any signs of movement. All of a sudden, 2 does and a very small buck leapt out of the trees and bounded across the field, moving swiftly across my firing line from right to left. They were on the very edge of my rifle's effective range, but I could tell that they were running from something. Sure enough, a few moments later, a group of 4 or 5 coyotes tumbled out of the brush in hot pursuit. It's rare for coyotes to be so aggressive, but when they have numbers on their side, nothing is off the table for them. The light was fading now, and as I watched through the scope, one of the deer began to fall behind the rest of the group. The coyotes were gaining on it rapidly. I considered firing into the air to scare them off, but I figured it wouldn't do anything with the pack all hopped up on adrenaline, so I decided not to waste the ammunition. However, as soon as the coyotes had the doe surrounded, and it looked like they were about to move in for an early supper, they suddenly stopped and began to yelp. All of them looked in the same direction and ignored the exhausted doe. At first, I was puzzled by this, but then I heard it. The low moaning howl had begun. It was barely audible, but it was surely there. The coyotes continued to yelp and bark, circling the doe nervously, but constantly looking across the field towards the opposite tree line, almost like they weren't sure whether to flee and leave their prey alone or ignore the howling and go in for the kill. The howling grew louder and louder, and the coyotes finally turned tail and ran back in the direction they'd come from, vanishing silently in the trees as the last of the evening light faded away. I peered through my scope and looked up and down the tree line that the coyotes had been fixated on just a few moments before, but in the inky darkness and rising mist, I could not see anything but the tangled shadows of sycamores and dogwoods. For just a moment, I thought maybe I caught a glimpse of movement, but I could not be sure in that gathering darkness. The howling continued for another half hour or so, and that whole time I stayed stone still in my tree stand. I was riveted to my seat in hopes of finally solving the mystery of the phantom sound, and I won't pretend that I wasn't a little bit scared to get down and walk across the fields, back to the house after what I'd just witnessed. But eventually, the rumbling of my stomach and the chill of the October air drove me back to the comfortable warmth of my house. That was not the last time I heard the howling. A Sound in the Dark, Part 2. Following that night in the tree stand, I was even more curious and on edge about the mysterious howl. But what could I do? I had checked every trail camera on the property and never seen anything out of the ordinary. A few deer, some coyotes, a neighbor's four-wheeler, a stray cat, and some raccoons and possums. Furthermore, on my regular rounds of checking the trees and fence lines, I'd never found any suspicious tracks or trails. And every time I had ventured back into the woods, often going fairly deep, to track deer, I hadn't seen anything more than a few coyote signs in deer beds. The mystery was occupying my thoughts more and more, and I was glad for any distraction that came my way. So, when one of my neighbors knocked on the door, wanting help gathering honey from his beehives, I was happy to accept and distract myself. If you've never extracted honey, it's an intensive job that requires constant supervision to do right, so my neighbor and I had plenty of time to talk. Mostly we made small talk, but gradually the conversation shifted to something we both had in common: hunting. We talked about the bucks we had seen that year and the best recipes for the perfect deer jerky. He briefly mentioned how it used to be much harder to hunt around these parts due to a pretty prolific poacher. I had never actually heard this story, beyond a few snippets of local folklore, so naturally I inquired about the details. All of this apparently happened well before my time, way back in the late 1970s, and according to my neighbor, who's a good 45 years my elder for context, the deer population in this part of the county had all but been wiped out at the hands of one man. He would trespass on all the farmsteads in the area with impunity, and he would hunt year-round. On more than one occasion, the sheriff was called, but the investigation never got anywhere since the poacher was always long gone by the time the lawmen arrived. Nobody in the area knew the guy either, which led to the rumor that he must have come across the county line. Eventually, the poaching just stopped, and most of the locals figured the law had finally caught up to him. That is until my grandfather and my great-uncle stumbled upon an overturned tree stand on the edge of their land, now my land, with several spent casings scattered across the base. A few dozen yards away, they discovered a broken rifle that they both immediately recognized as belonging to that poacher. The police were called and a detective was sent to the farm. He asked my grandfather a few questions about the poacher and eventually pulled out a photograph, asking if this was the man in question. Sure enough, it was him, and when they told the detective as much, he informed them that the man was the subject of a missing persons investigation. About a month prior, he had simply fallen off the face of the earth. Police and canine units combed the area around the farm afterwards, but no trace of the man was ever found. The police eventually closed the missing persons case and ruled the man's death an accident. They reasoned that the man's tree stand had toppled over due to wind or uneven ground, and he had been mortally wounded in the fall. Maybe he had survived long enough to crawl away and had died of his wounds somewhere else. Or maybe he had died on the spot and his body had simply been dispersed by scavenging animals. Of course, nobody around here actually believed that. The general consensus was that one of the locals had finally gotten fed up with his hijinks and decided to take matters into their own hands. But nobody could ever figure out who had done it, and no one ever came forward to talk about it, so the issue had quietly faded into obscurity. This story was one that I'd heard referenced occasionally in passing by my grandfather, but I had never heard the tale in its entirety. Honestly, it made me think of the way the howling had scared off the coyotes in the middle of their hunt just a few nights before. It was as though they were familiar with the sound and only needed a warning to be afraid of it, perhaps thanks to a past experience. We didn't chat much more after that, and when we had finally sealed the last jar of honey, I quickly went on my way and hurried back to the farmhouse before nightfall. For close to 20 days after the night in the fields, things were mostly quiet. I had heard the howling one other time in the interim, but it had simply started around nightfall and lasted for about half an hour with no other weird occurrences to speak of. I remember the night of the final incident distinctly, because there was a bright, full, or very close to full, moon in the sky, and without it, I may not have been able to see what I witnessed that night. It was a cool and crisp Friday evening, and my girlfriend was staying with me at the farmhouse, as neither of us had work in the morning. We had spent the afternoon helping one of my neighbors put out decorations around her own farm, because she and her husband would be doing hay rides and a haunted trail that weekend. After all, Halloween was only a few days away. It just had to be the extra spooky time of year, didn't it? After that, we had returned to my place as the sun was beginning to set. We then worked all evening on a flurry of baking and home cooking, taking advantage of all the fresh fall produce. Anyway, after an afternoon of lugging hay bales and pumpkins and scarecrows all over my neighbor's property, as well as a hectic evening of cooking, we were both completely tuckered out. We headed to bed around 11 o'clock. The both of us were so exhausted that we fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up in the middle of the night. My watch on the bedside table said 2:20, and I was suddenly very awake. I wasn't sure yet what had awakened me, but I could tell right away that I was not going to be able to get back to sleep for a while. I didn't want to wake up my girlfriend, as she was still sound asleep, so I figured I would just get some water from the kitchen and find something to read until I was tired enough to fall back asleep. As I walked downstairs and into the kitchen, the pleasant scents of cinnamon and sugar and fresh fruits filled my nose, and got me thinking of all the fine desserts I would be enjoying in the next few days. But as I held a glass under the faucet to fill it with water, I was snapped out of my daydreaming by the fact that if I listened closely, I could hear the howling. By then, I might as well have had a cup of full-strength coffee, because I was wide awake. The howling had never persisted so late into the night before, and it had never been so loud for me to hear it inside the house so clearly. I walked briskly to the parlor at the front of the house, and I noticed that the howling was even louder there. I have to admit, I was more than a little bit hesitant to open the blinds of the front window, scared of what might be awaiting me on the other side of the glass. My curiosity was stronger than my fear, though, and I quietly unfurled the blinds, letting the sapphire moonlight filter into the otherwise dark room. Thankfully, there was no mothman or werewolf waiting on the front porch, and as I scanned the yard and tree line, I was almost disappointed that there was no obvious source to the noise. However, as I looked closer, I spotted something I had missed at first glance. Sitting there in the driveway, so still as to be almost invisible, was the shape of a deer. If it weren't for the bright moonlight, I may have overlooked it completely. On closer inspection, several odd things stood out about the shape. It was not sitting like a deer usually does, down on its belly with its legs tucked underneath it. Instead, it was positioned more like a dog, sitting on its hind end with its rear legs tucked at its sides and its front legs supporting it as it leaned forward. Most strikingly, it had a magnificent crown of antlers, 14 points at least, but by contrast, its body was quite slender. It had so little meat around the middle of it that it really looked malnourished or emaciated. I stared at it for a few moments before coming to my senses, and when I thought more about what I was looking at, I realized that the poor thing must have been pretty badly hurt. With hunters in the woods flushing them out, they're far more likely to wander into the road. While deer are pretty tough animals, especially big bucks with 14-point racks, it's not uncommon for a deer to limp or drag itself away from the scene of an accident, only to perish of starvation a few weeks later due to its injuries. I figured that the animal in the driveway had probably been hit on a nearby road a week or so ago and had broken its back legs, hence the gaunt appearance and strange posture. Furthermore, the responsible thing to do with such an animal is to grant it a quick and merciful death in order to keep it from suffering too much or from contracting diseases in its weakened state that it could transmit to other members of the herd or even people. With that in mind, I retrieved my .44 from the safe and loaded the cylinder before going back upstairs to warn my girlfriend. I didn't think she would exactly appreciate being awakened at 2:30 in the morning by the sound of a gunshot less than 50 yards from the house. I shook her awake gently and told her that a deer had been hit by a car and that I had to go out and put it out of its misery. She just groggily pulled a pillow over her head and said, "Tell me about it in the morning," before rolling over and going back to sleep. I made my way down to the front entrance, but as soon as I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the front porch, I realized that something was very strange. The sound of the howling was extremely intense. It was as though I was in the middle of a tornado, and yet there was nothing more than a slight breeze blowing through the chilly evening air. The sound was so intense, it seemed to be pressed on my ears and reverberated in my chest, making me tense up and brace myself against its force. As I slowly inched closer to the deer shape, the howling grew louder and louder, and I began to notice a few more things about the deer in the driveway. I had initially observed the deer's thin body as a sign of malnutrition and starvation, but its ribs weren't sticking out or even really showing. It simply had a small and thin frame. From a closer perspective, I could also see that its fur was immaculate and glossy, without a single matted or bloodied patch anywhere. Certainly not what you'd expect of an animal that had been recently hit by a truck. I couldn't really make out the color of its fur in the brilliant silver moonlight, but I could very much tell that it was not the trademark tawny coat of your average whitetail. It had remained facing away from me the whole time, but as I drew closer to a distance of about 15 yards or so, it turned its head to face me. Its head was the correct shape for a deer or elk, but where its face and eyes and nostrils and mouth should have been, there was nothing at all. Its head was simply covered in a featureless coat of fur matching the rest of its body. The howling was deafening now, and I was left with only one explanation. The creature was the source of the phantom howl that had hung over the farm for the past month, and I was face to face with it, or rather face to not face. I stared in a combination of awe and horror at the bizarre animal sitting before me, and I slowly lowered my hand to my side, finding the grip of my revolver. It's difficult to describe, but I could tell the creature was watching my hand, despite its lack of eyes. I left my hand on my gun, but made no effort to draw it from its holster or pull the hammer back. We simply stared at one another for several moments before the deer thing began to move. Effortlessly and gracefully, without making a single sound other than the constant howl, it stood up on two legs, rising to its full height in the brilliant light of the moon. It stood noticeably taller than me, making it comfortably over 6 feet tall, though that's not counting the considerable bulk of the antlers that rose still higher above its head. It had an ever so slight hunch to its stance, as though it split its time equally between standing upright and being on all fours. Its arms were very long and slender, ending in human-like hands. However, they weren't bony, gaunt, claw-like hands. They were delicate and graceful ones, like those of a young woman. Its legs were articulated like a deer's, and they ended in a pair of split hooves like a deer. But the structure of the legs was far more dense and muscular to support walking upright. As for me, I should have been pumping the thing full of lead or screaming or quaking in abject terror, but instead, I had actually begun to feel calm. There was a towering, faceless deer man standing less than 25 feet in front of me, but I was calm. It was then that I realized the howling had ended. The night air was tranquilly serene, with no noise except for the slight rustle of the October breeze through the trees and bushes. I have no idea how long we stood there looking at each other, but finally the deer thing dropped back to all fours, turned calmly, and bounded off down the hill toward the fields. I followed it with my eyes for several moments, before it seemed to simply vanish into the silver light of the moon and the midnight mist rising from the damp grass. The next thing I remember was waking up the following morning, having slept soundly the entire night. I don't remember going back inside, and I was so at ease and well rested that for a moment I thought the events of the night before were simply a dream, a fabrication of my stressed out mind to give me some sort of fake closure. However, as I got out of bed, I saw that my revolver was lying on the nightstand beside it, and upon closer inspection there were 6 unfired shells in the cylinder. Likewise, as soon as my girlfriend rolled over and saw that I was awake, she asked me what had happened to the wounded deer the night before. I told her that it must have been fine, since it had run off by the time I'd gotten outside, which seemed a lot easier than recounting the full tale of the thing I saw in the early morning hours. After that night, I never heard the howling again, but to this day, coyotes don't often trespass on my land. I am not sure just what the thing I saw was, but I have my hunches. Way back in my family tree, the first of my family to own the land where the farm now sits married a full-blooded Catawba woman, and he received the land as a part of dowry. Technically, this means that I'm part Native American, but the percentage for me is so small that I don't really identify with it at all. However, my grandfather was much closer to that part of the family's heritage, and when he taught me to hunt as a child, he always stressed to me the importance of giving thanks for the bounty of the land and properly respecting it. Have a good harvest of apples that you can't handle yourself? Leave some for the deer. Have more blackberries than you need? Leave those for the birds. Only take what you can take without harming the natural balance of the land. That sort of thing. My theory is that the thing I saw on that autumn night was a spirit, or a creature, or a guardian, something like that, which is tied to the land and keeps it in balance. It attacked those coyotes because they are invasive and destructive, and it may have very well been behind the disappearance of that poacher all those years ago. I'm not sure about why it disappeared after that night either. Maybe its work was just finished here. But I do know one thing for sure, that even though I haven't heard the howling or seen that thing in almost 8 months, I know it's still out there. That being said, I'm not worried. My family has always cared for the land, and if the creature had wanted to harm me that night under the moon, I'm sure it could have. I've never told anyone else about this. I mean, who'd believe me? For now, though, things are calm, and with a little bit of luck, they'll stay that way for a long time to come. The Whimpering Thing from Nihilo. This happened a few months ago when I went solo camping in the outback of Flinders Ranges in South Australia. I've told my close friends and family, but they say I'm just being funny, as there's something keeping me from describing what I saw exactly. You'll come to know why near the end of the story, and I'll try my best to tell you why I can't say certain things. Anyway, here's my story of something truly bizarre, weird, and psychologically draining on my end. You see, I'm a hobbyist photographer. I purchased a high-end camera in hopes that, after spending thousands on it, it would force me to practice and ultimately take it more seriously. I'd recently got my hands on a new Sigma Art 20mm 1.4 lens. I wanted to give astrophotography a real shot. I knew the fundamentals about it, and only lacked an area to do it. As luck would have it, I had a chance to. My fiancée was flying to Melbourne with one of her friends for 2 days, for shopping and city life. I figured I'd take the chance to drive out the 6 to 8 hours to Flinders and camp for the night. There's virtually zero light pollution there, and makes it prime for taking shots of the Milky Way. I'd been to Wilpena compound once before with friends, and it gave me amazing results with the lesser lenses I had, so I knew this was going to be stellar. I set off early that morning after my partner had caught her plane. I drove all the way up, stopping once for a bathroom break. I never imagined I'd camp alone like this, but after seeing so many videographers and photographers do it on YouTube, I figured what the heck. It's only 2 nights, right? Being the weekend, I wanted a really secluded place all to myself, so I could set up my camp, my camera gear, etc., and most importantly, not be disturbed. I checked out the maps and decided on taking one of the off-road trails for 4x4s. Then I'd take a detour off into the bush, and I'd camp there. Now, I wasn't stupid, and didn't literally wander off too deep. I made sure wherever I went, it would be a super easy, straightforward turnaround. Then I could get back to my ute, or truck if you're from the States. Anyway, after the drive and me detouring and looking for a literal off-the-grid zone where I knew no one except a few kangaroos and local wildlife would be, I parked my ute and headed off. This particular area was full of thick bush and old scraggly-looking trees. The trees themselves were perfect for a nice composition for my astro shots. The sky was clear, and the new moon meant zero light pollution. After about 40 minutes of casual, slow walking, always looking for a perfect tree, I decided to set up camp before it got too dark. Just as I was walking to a nice clearing, I heard what sounded like a far-off animal whimper. It was sort of like how a dog does if it's scared, possibly a wild dingo or something. Just a typical canine sound, I thought. I could tell it was far off, so I didn't pay too much mind to it. Plus, I was smart enough to bring a small hatchet for firewood, as well as a knife. Plus, once a fire is going, I doubt they'd hang around. I brushed it off and set up my swag and camera. I made a nice small fire pit and headed off nearby for some kindling and wood. It was getting dusk and the light was slowly fading. I didn't own a watch and used my phone to check the time. My phone, as it turns out, would play a huge role in the coming events. You see, out here, signal was basically non-existent. Very, very rarely it seemed an intermittent signal would fly in, and my phone would ping for a moment. I put it on vibrate so not to annoy me too much. It would vibrate every hour or so. I looked at my phone and it read 7:48, so I hurried along and started gathering wood. After 10 minutes or so of grabbing whatever I could find, I heard that whimpering sound again slightly louder, but I ignored it altogether. I was fixated on getting my firewood and returning to camp. I finished getting what I could carry and got back. I started getting the fire made. After a couple hours of building the fire, having a bit of snacks and boiling some soup placed in the fire coals, I checked up to see if I could see the Milky Way. Out here you can visibly see the dust in space outlining the Milky Way. I couldn't see it, so I figured I had to wait earlier in the morning. I checked my phone and had zero signal. No biggie. It was 12:34 a.m. by then. Last I recalled, the Milky Way would be best visible around 1 to 3 a.m. So I stayed up and waited, reading a book. It was then that I heard the crack of sticks nearby. Hearing this out of the blackness was enough to scare me right to death. I realized how silly that was, that an animal could scare me so much, just from walking. I mean, it had to be some animal. This area was extremely remote, and kangaroos were extremely common out here. Just as I gathered my composure again, the hairs on my body instantly flew up. I'd never experienced such a chilling sensation. My heart flew into my throat, and I could barely swallow. All the ambient noises of insects, nightlife animals, wind through bushes just completely vanished. This sensation, though, I couldn't explain it. I felt exactly what it was. Something was watching me intently, and I couldn't move. I was trembling inside with a fear I wouldn't wish on even my worst enemies. I could feel tears welling up, and I had trouble swallowing. What was going on with me? Why was it so quiet all of a sudden? I was panicking inside more than I ever had before. I sat there frozen, locked up, choking, my throat closing on me. It was the most severe case of anxiety I'd ever had. But from what? What was going on? Then I heard it. The whimpering sound again. This time, it only came from a few feet behind me in the bush. I desperately tried to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. Only my eyes, which frantically searched around looking for any sign of movement, could move at all. I was looking for any means of hope in getting out of this situation. I then spotted my flashlight beside me. But I couldn't move. I was crying now, tears falling down my face, my breathing tight and fast. I could barely get any air past my throat. Maybe I was having a heart attack, I told myself. No, this was different. Then the noise came again, sticks crunching underfoot of something, whimpering again, but longer. I felt its presence, and a severe dread flushed throughout my body. I was shutting down. Fight or flight completely skipped me. I was past the point of choosing, as if my body knew that neither fight nor flight were possible against whatever this was. I sensed it watching me, drawing closer, my body trembling more. I began to develop a thick sweat on my body. Just when I felt like I was going mad, there was a loud crackle from seemingly nowhere. The fire I had made had splintered a big stick and embers flew off, illuminating the area around me. Another loud whimper followed, and then instantly, as if a miracle, my body moved. The sounds of the forest returned, and my hairs fell back into place. My throat opened back up, and I rapidly began breathing in. I grabbed my flashlight, spinning around with it, aiming it at the bush, but saw nothing. Where did it go? Did the firelight scare it off? Whatever happened, I gave up the idea of shooting the skies that night. I just didn't feel safe anymore. Just as a child cuddles blankets when they're scared, I needed something to comfort me desperately. I knew I would not be able to stay up all night now, and I was tired from the long drive and exploring. I figured my best option would be to grab my hatchet and knife, then get in my swag, a small tent. Then I would wait as long as I could. If something came again, I'd hopefully be ready. It was a silly idea, I know, but I was exhausted now more than ever. That adrenaline had completely drained me. There's no way I'd be able to stay up anyway to take shots of the sky, even if I wanted to. I did have the idea to set up my camera and use my wide-angle lens to cover the entire campsite, just to see what gets caught. I cranked up the ISO, the artificial light, in case anyone doesn't know what that is, so it would show whatever was in frame. Then I got in my swag. I heard nothing for what seemed like an hour or so, and I felt myself drifting off. Maybe that thing got spooked and left. I was starting to think that I'd been scared over nothing. My eyes were feeling heavy, and I soon fell asleep. I woke up an unknown amount of time later from a noise, but I wasn't sure what it was. Then I knew straight away. It was that whimpering again. My fire was out, and I could not see any light through my swag. I held close to my hatchet and my knife. The whimpering turned into a whining noise, remaining longer with each release. I was nearly crying already. This wasn't funny. I wanted to escape. I wish I'd never come. Why was this happening to me? The whining was as close now as it was before. And then nothing. All the noise had just been erased from the world. My body locked up like before. My eyes grew wide and my chest grew tight. I knew then that whatever it was staring at me through the tent. This sensation, I knew it came only when that creature had me in its sights. My body was forfeiting itself to it. I don't know why. It was like this creature had the ability to lock its prey down from the sheer terror it invoked. Is this how it hunted things? Once fixated, the natural aura from this creature just shut down its prey. Then the negative thoughts began to rush through my mind. I was going to die here. There's no one around to save me. I couldn't move. I was at the mercy at whatever was outside. My mind was going haywire. Then one phrase echoed in my head. I love you, to my fiancée. At the very least, my camera would take shots of this thing, and maybe someone would find me and know what happened. Then they could hunt it down. The whining grew so loud, it was right up against my swag. It was right next to me, nearly touching me. Then my swag began to move. I couldn't even react to this. I was helplessly laying there, giving myself up to it, when I didn't think I could be more terrified of it. Something else happened. A different noise emerged, one that's harder to describe. A low guttural. It was crackly, bassy, and it just stayed, never stopping. An object ran alongside my tent, making its way down to the side, toward the zipper. I was begging in my mind for something to make this all stop, but I was on my own. It's then that I hate to admit that I soiled myself. It didn't matter to me at the time, because I was going to die. I watched the zipper to the swag slowly lower, and all I could do was watch, the audience to my own demise. If this thing wasn't going to kill me, my heart would probably explode or stop anyway. The low, crackling noise remained indefinite. My zipper was halfway down. I closed my eyes, ready to be taken. The sound was now over me. I kept wondering, should I open my eyes now and at least see who my attacker is? If I could just move, I could move my head up to the small fly net opening at the top of my swag. No, it was no use. I'd only see it for a few moments before the end. I kept my eyes closed, picturing my fiancée. Then there was a buzzing sound. My eyes shot open. My body fell back into place. My throat and my heart went back to normal. I could move again. But that clicking sound and the zipper lowering continued. My phone had vibrated. With that little bit of reception, something came through and vibrated with a notification and woke me out of that stupor. Or was it hypnosis? But that thing was still there outside, about to be inside. I was going to see what this thing was and fight back now. I lifted my head to look through the fly net, and my brain instantly shut down. It was staring at me. I don't know with what. I can't explain it, but its vision had an effect on my mind and perception. I knew that I was looking at it and it looking at me. It stopped making that noise and it shifted its body, but its body did not stay the same. It had many eyes, yet none. A mouth, but no mouth. The moment my brain saw something and perceived it, it changed. What was I looking at? Nothing made sense. I glanced at my phone and saw that it was 6 a.m. The sun was making its way slowly up. But despite the daybreak approaching, I was still in danger and I needed to leave. I left everything except my camera and what I could carry without packing. I ran as fast as my lungs could carry me. I made it back to my ute. I floored it, not stopping until I reached a rest stop area a couple of hours down the road. And then I remembered my camera, checking it, hoping beyond hope that I saw something to explain this. But just as my perception had been when witnessing that thing, the photos were corrupted. Every single one of them that I'd taken when I was out there. It's impossible for me to explain what it was that I saw. It goes beyond physical comprehension. Every time I think I remember how it looked, a different image takes its place. I can't tell people what it was, no matter how much I wish I could. And I don't care what it was, because I know how dangerous it is, and I will never go back there. My best description I can give you is imagine the Google artificial imaging with all the different animals and eyes staring back. When I try to process it, my mind gets so busy and I immediately feel exhausted. So I just keep it to myself. I've told some friends and family who laugh and say nice try. I ignore this. I wish I knew exactly what it was. I've never experienced anything like it to this day. I've done research and found nothing. The closest I've come to anything similar are those missing 411 files, where people go missing mysteriously. Maybe there's a correlation. Maybe there's not. But I do know that I may have almost met a similar fate to them. If my phone had not vibrated when it did, I never would have been seen again. I have a friend named John, from RJB. On May 19th in 2015, John came home a different man. It was the night that haunts his dreams. I knew him once as a bright, happy, and kind man, but after that night, he was different. John was a forest ranger in Arkansas for 8 years. He was 6'5", never got scared very easily. He was a tough and rather built guy, and on that night, I had pulled into his driveway at around 10:30 p.m. to pay him a surprise visit. I lived in Louisiana at the time. He hadn't made it home from work yet, so I figured he might have had to work later than usual, as he'd said that it happens sometimes. He didn't know I was coming, and I hadn't seen him in 2 years. John pulled up about half an hour after me. He parked beside me and shut off the engine. However, he did not get out. I got out of my little Ford Ranger and walked to the passenger side to open his door. I opened it to see a grown man crying. The smell of alcohol was thick in the air. Obviously, he had been drinking. "John, what's wrong?" I asked him nervously. He continued to cry, so I placed my hand on his shoulder, but he immediately jerked away. "John, it's me, Ryan." I thought he may not have recognized me, because I had grown a full beard in the 2 years we hadn't hung out. "Come on, man, let's go inside," I told him. He clumsily stumbled out of his truck. I wrapped my arm around him, helping him walk. Then I carried him over to his sofa and sat next to him. "John, what the hell happened to you?" He didn't respond at first, but he did stop crying at a point. He was pale and had a look on his face like he had been to war. Shell shock, I think it's called. I repeated myself. He looked at me with tears drying in his cheeks. "God, Ryan." He stumbled over to me with shaking legs and gave me a hug. "Yeah, you have no idea how happy I am to see you," he whimpered. John had been my best friend since grade school. We grew up always hanging out, mostly wandering around the nearby woods, climbing trees, and as we reached our teens, we'd often go camping together. We had never been scared in the woods. The only strange occurrence was when we found some weird footprints one time, but that's a different story. He let go of me and grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the freezer, pouring us both a glass. "Don't you think you've had enough?" I said as he handed me my glass. John calmed down and ignored me. "Can you at least answer my question? What happened, John? I don't think I've ever seen you like this before." Like I said, he'd always been a happy-go-lucky guy. He spoke. "There's some weird crap going on in those damn woods." "What do you mean?" I asked, worried. Ryan, we found a body today," he replied. I was puzzled. I know he had found bodies before, but he'd never been this upset about it. "I'm sorry, man." I genuinely was sorry for him. "Go ahead, tell me everything." He downed the glass of whiskey in no time and poured more in it. And this was different. This wasn't like the other bodies we'd seen. There was something Something had been eating him, he said, swirling the glass around before he downed a second. I was still on my first. Good God, John, stop. That's enough, I said, grabbing the bottle and putting it back in the freezer. Fine, he groaned. I asked him what was eating this man's body. I don't know. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, he said. I told him to start at the beginning. He spoke. I was at HQ when we received a missing person call. The woman said she and her husband had been hiking on one of the more remote trails when her husband decided to walk a ways off the trail to take a leak. She waited for 10 minutes for her husband to come back. She yelled for him, but she didn't get a reply. She went into the trees in the direction she saw him go, but she didn't find him. She instead found blood on the ground. That's when she called us. My coworker Bill and I immediately packed our gear and headed to the location he was last seen. We didn't have to go far, because we found an arm about 100 yards off the trail, and the rest of him was about 50 yards further. The sun had already set, but we had our mag lights. When I found him, there was something else. Something squatting over him, and I could hear it tearing flesh off his body as it was ripping chunks of meat off him and swallowing them. John began to tear up again, but he pulled himself back together and continued. I shined my flashlight to get a better look at what it was. I should have just ran. God, I just froze, though. Bill was just terrified. We couldn't move. It stood up and turned around towards us, giving us a full view. It was tall, about 7 feet. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and seemed like the skin was painfully stretched over old bones. It was so thin. It had a single large, pure black eye on the left side of its face, too. Its mouth opened, and it made this weird insect-like clicking sound. It didn't even have a normal mouth. It opened up like a bloomin' flower, like petals filled with rows upon rows of teeth. The mouth seemed to vibrate, too, as it made the sound. He paused, grabbed a cigarette from his pack, and lit it. He took a long puff and exhaled. His story sounded insane, but the look of pure fear in his face told me otherwise. From the look of him, he seemed to be telling the truth. Sure, he would sometimes lie to prank me, but those tears, that desperate need to drink, that was all real. Please, go on, I told him, and he did. I pulled out my .45 and took aim. My coworker screamed and ran, so I prayed it'd do some damage, or at least buy us some time. It lunged at me and I fired. It wailed, and I proceeded to empty the clip that I had. However, it still stood there, though it was bleeding bad, but it acted like it was just a scratch. I ran. I'd never been so scared in my life. Jesus Christ. I thought I was gonna die. He took another drag. My lungs, my legs burned. I felt like I was gonna pass out at any second. We made it back to HQ and turned around to see if the thing had followed us, but there was nothing there. We were safe. Or we assumed we were safe. I sat there in disbelief, still holding a mostly full glass of Jack. Oh God, I replied. That sounds awful, John. Don't I know it? But it was so vivid, so real, he said, with trembling hands. Ryan, I'm done working the late shift. The police took a statement and Bill quit on the spot. The police said it was probably a hallucination caused by shock of finding a corpse like that, but I was adamant that what we saw was real. One of the officers pulled me aside and said quietly so no one else would hear, If I were you, I'd just forget what you saw. It's better to let us handle it. Man, they know what's out there, but they won't tell us details. I'm honestly terrified to go back. Screw risking my life for this job. I'm not going out after dark again. John finished telling his experience. I'm going to bed now, and I think you should do the same. John got up, gave me a bro hug and a thank you, and went to his room. But I didn't sleep much that night. I know this is a long and pretty unbelievable story, but I do believe there's something in the forests of northern Arkansas. Something who, just by the sight of it, has haunted my friend. Whatever it is, it doesn't care if you have family or friends. It's something that won't hesitate to rip you apart and devour you bit by bit. Be careful out there. Sometimes you don't know how scary it is out there until it's too late. The Beast of Mogo Gold Rush Colony, from the Angry Dremora. I live in New South Wales, Australia. This encounter took place in October of 2014. I was 12 years old at the time, and in my last year of primary school. For the school camp that year, we would spend 2 days down at Mogo Gold Rush Colony, an old preserved gold rush colony from the times of the gold rush in Australia, since at the time we were learning about British colonization and our early history. It's located a few miles south of Bateman's Bay and is surrounded by the bush. The bus ride was fun but taxing, as we lived in Wollongong, which is nearly 3 hours north of Bateman's Bay. We finally arrived late in the afternoon. They sorted us into our cabins. My friends and I were put in the cabins closest to the tree line, which was also closest to the bridge leaving from the living quarters. My friends and I had packed our PSPs, board games, and David even brought his small pinball machine that I had bought him for his birthday. We were also completely stocked up on sweets and snacks. We were planning to stay up long into the night, having fun. After dinner that night, we were made to sit with our formal partner and listen to the local Aboriginal elder named Sam. I sat on a log with my then girlfriend, Gemma. Sam talked about a lot of things. He went into great depth on the British impact of the Aboriginals. He talked about the troubles they brought along with them, and eventually asked if we liked scary stories, and everyone excitedly said yes. Sam then told us that the Aborigines had many creatures from their stories they believed in, like the Bunyip and the Yawa Mawa Yahoo. That's what it sounded like. His face eventually grew dark and grim, before saying that the British also brought their own monsters with them. He mentioned one beast in particular that all of us kids recognized: the European werewolf. One boy laughed and said, "Werewolves aren't real. They're just cool myths made up by movie makers." The old man looked over to the boy and said, "Well, I pray you never meet one yourself." As cliché and silly as he sounded, he looked dead serious, even concerned, which only made me feel more unsettled. We were then told to go back to our cabins to unwind. It took many of the rowdier cabins a few hours to do that, but soon it was just us. One of the teachers, a Miss R, had to come down because Liam had broke a light bulb by accident, so she had to take him back to stay with teachers, because the assistant principal had also gone with us. So she had to follow the school's protocol, leaving only Cohen, Brody, Lachlan, David, and myself. Lachlan had been hit by an extreme homesickness though, which had him crying, and so Brody, being the legend he was, kept him company, comforting him and telling him, "It's all gonna be alright, Lachlan. We're gonna have a great time." We all had a set of double bunk beds lining the cabin, up to the bathroom at the back. It was like a flat, almost. Quite a cozy double cabin. Another group had one next door to us. The cabin only had 2 windows, one in between my bunk and Lachlan and Brody's bunk bed, and the other above the toilet. A silly place to have a window that's not tinted in some way. But it did have a shutter that we kept open for light from the outside. At around 1 a.m., it began pelting down rain. Lachlan was still crying. David was playing his PSP with his headphones in, and Cohen and I were talking. I had the urge to go to the bathroom, and as I stood there doing my business, I suddenly heard Lachlan screaming. The window! There was something standing there! I glance out the window to the side of the cabin, and I see it. A huge black figure covered in fur. It appeared to be squatting on 2 legs which were bent back like a Hollywood werewolf. Its arms were down to its knees with long, bony fingers that ended in claws the length of steel nails. It had a semi-muscular build and the head of a dog. But there was something wrong with it. Its maw was more like a wolf's, and its ears were more small. It had a shaggy mane and wet black nose that dripped from the downpour outside. It had placed one of its hands on the window, looking inside at the kids. With its other hand, it scraped down the glass with a claw, as if measuring how thick it was. Its face was mischievous, intelligent. It enjoyed the fear that it was giving Lachlan. I began to slowly close the shutter of the bathroom window, not taking my eyes off the thing. However, the blinds made a loud squeak, and as soon as I started, the beast turned instantly to face me. I wished I hadn't done that. The beast stared at me. That was when I got a good look at its face. I tremble every time I think of that face. Words fail to describe exactly what I saw, but I'll do my best. Its eyes were like a bright amber that seemed to glow in the embers of a fire. It slowly began to bare sharp teeth at me with a sinister-looking snarl, a mixture of saliva and rain dripping from its exposed mouth. It let out a low growl so deep I could feel it vibrating my chest. I was completely frozen in fear, and I could feel myself lost in the thing's eyes. Its gaze was one of hatred and rage, but I felt a sense of curiosity too. I wanted to see what it was going to do next, even if that meant trying to attack me. It began to run its long razor-like claws down the side of the wooden wall of the cabin. All the while, it didn't break eye contact with me. I could see the black claws glistening in the rain from the light of the gazebo. Then I saw a flashlight bobbing behind it. The teachers, they must have heard Lachlan screaming because all of them came down from the trail. The beast then glared angrily in their direction before giving me one last look. It got down on all fours and began to take off at an alarming speed, kicking up bark chips everywhere. I raced to the window it was at before and watched the beast bound towards the colony and over the bridge. All the while it kicked up that dirt and grass. David had been playing his PSP with headphones in and did not hear or see any of this. Brody had stayed on the bottom bunk, which he chose to stay put in, as Cohen stayed in his. Lachlan was now sobbing hysterically at this point. The teachers unlocked the door and burst inside. Lachlan kept saying there was a monster at the window, but Miss Chapman didn't believe him. She turned to me and asked, "Did you see a monster?" I pointed at the scratches on the window without saying a word and moved past her to climb into my bunk. Miss Chapman observed them and then simply said she would find the little troublemaker who did this, to which I replied, "Good luck." She clearly didn't see the size and width of the scratches, or she refused to buy that something did that, as in Australia we don't have big cats or bears, so I guess to her it was nothing. Most of my friends managed to fall asleep, even Lachlan, but I lay there, wondering if it was going to come back, wondering what it wanted to do. I then closed the shutter to the window above my head and soon I drifted off to sleep. I woke up last. I had slept through a lot. Liam had come back and was being rowdy and messing about with David. David was chasing him up and down the cabin in nothing but an Iron Man mask and underwear, screaming like a maniac. David was quite out of shape, so you can imagine how absurd he looked. Lachlan, Brody, and Cohen were quiet. We didn't speak a word until we got changed for the day. That day we were taken on a tour of one of the mines that had been restored, and David and I decided to split off from the group and explore the colony ourselves. As we wandered through the town, he couldn't help but wonder why there were claw marks on some of the walls of the old buildings. This sent chills down my spine. I knew what did it. I know what I saw the previous night. We decided to check out the back of a barber shop, which was immediately backed by thick forest. There we were hit by a foul odor. David said we should follow it to find what it is. This sounded like a terrible idea, but I gave in to peer pressure, and I was curious if we would run into our hairy friend again. But what we saw made me throw up. In a clearing not too far from the barber's back lot was a mangled mess that used to be a kangaroo. There were parts of it scattered all over the ground and forest at the base of a large gum tree. It looked like something much bigger than it had slammed it against the tree repeatedly. David breathed. What the heck could have done this? I urged him that we should leave, and we did, rejoining the group, who were down the road at the blacksmith. I then took the chance to tell him what we saw the previous night that he had missed. I told him how Liam used to own a book called Werewolves, Vampires, and Zombies, which contained a section on cryptids. In particular, I told him about the Beast of Bray Road and how it looked similar to the drawing in that book. He wasn't skeptical at all, given the slaughtered kangaroo we found. Soon the guide led us to the barber with the class, and not long after that everyone began complaining about the smell. So the guide discovered the handiwork of the beast for himself, and then told us to go back to the old schoolhouse, before gold panning. Soon I saw a few other workers meet up with him to help. They discussed what to do with the situation. They then disappeared to clean up the monster's masterpiece. During lunch, David and I went to explore the caravan park, stumbling upon the largest gaggle of geese we'd ever seen. These geese were vicious though and roamed the whole property. After that night of formal dance practice, we returned to the cabin and unwinded for bed. Before it got dark, I closed the outside steel shutters in the windows, and we locked everything down. We even shut the blinds for good measure. I locked the doors, and with help from Lachlan, we barricaded the door with the wardrobe. Liam didn't understand why we were doing all this, and asked what on earth was going on. I simply told him the lock was busted. We all fell asleep that night fairly fast, to the sounds of cicadas, and crickets. But I was slowly awakened at around 4 by a subtle bump. The sounds of the night had ceased. Not even the early birds you'd hear were sounding up. The thumping continued, and soon it sounded like the screeching of steel as something began to claw at the metal around the building, which there wasn't a lot of, so it had to have been going out of its way to do this. I knew immediately that the beast was back. I was beginning to shake and feel nauseous, thinking that that thing could easily smash its way inside. I closed my eyes, beginning to pray, reciting the Lord's words, and asked for aid. Soon I could hear it growling at something. Then the scratching and thumping ceased. I then hear the distinctive sound of geese, followed by a deafening roar that shook the building. Suddenly there was the sound of fluttering and whacking sounds. The cries of the geese grew louder, hundreds of them. Then there was another roar that seemed annoyed. It growled and snarled, and then walked away into the bush. The sounds of the geese heckling it continued and seemed to follow it, and soon everything went quiet again, and the sounds of the night returned. By then, everyone was now awake from the commotion. Liam was begging to know what happened. I told him I wasn't sure. After unlocking everything at 5:30 a.m. and unbarricading the door, Lachlan and I decided to examine the outside of the cabin, and it was a mess. Claw marks down the shutter, indentations in the wood from it pounding and pounding, bark chips everywhere, feathers scattered about the ground, a few dead geese. We moved the dead birds away. We knew we'd be questioned about the damage, and the dead geese wouldn't help. So we dumped them into the creek separating the cabins from the colony. We then began to pack our things. Later that morning, we stopped at the Mogo Zoo, and shortly after that, we were on our way home. We didn't talk much on the bus ride. The past 2 nights had been very traumatic for us, and Liam and Brody remained skeptical, even though the evidence of the creature was right there. A few months passed, and I'm starting high school during that time. I became obsessed with Skyrim, and when I did that quest line where you could become a werewolf, I felt nauseous at the sight of it. It was uncanny how similar the werewolf in that game and the beast we saw a few months back were. The only person I ever told was my dad. With a frightened expression, he quickly believed me and told me his own story, which happened in Moriua. That's 30 minutes south of the Gold Rush colony. He was sleeping in a granny flat under the house, which could only be accessed from the outside. He and his brother woke up to what sounded like the tapping of steel on the glass. He looked and saw the beast with the head and face of a dog or wolf peeking in at him, grinning with that same grin I saw that rainy night. To this day, I wonder what would have happened to us if we hadn't been separated by a wall from that terrifying monster who turned animals into pulp. The Thing from Psychotic Wisdom. It was a cold October morning in the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. The leaves were crisp and dew and had already formed from last night. They crystallized upon everything, as if it all had been frozen. I had my way too expensive tent set up, and was aggravated as I already found a tear in it. Now, a lot of people may be confused as to why someone would be camping in such freezing weather, but I was there for a good reason. Something had been eating and scaring my animals for God knows how long, and I've grown extremely tired of it. I was here to see if I could find it, to at least see what was terrorizing my farm. I have a little farm with sheep and cows. They're my pride and joy, and I love taking care of them. And when something began to eat and hurt and scare them, it infuriated me. It all started about 2 years ago, when some of the animals began to disappear, and I needed to find out why. People think I'm crazy for not just brushing it off my shoulders and thinking it's a bear or something else more common. Well, if you would have seen the weird tracks it left, then you wouldn't think I'm so crazy. The tracks were like human tracks, but then again at the same time they were different. They were longer and wider than a person's, with a different number of digits. It gave me chills imagining what kind of monster could be putting my animals in danger. So there I was, out in the Appalachians camping and following these tracks. Maybe it was an insane idea to camp alone when something dangerous was out there, but I didn't really have the time to wait for anyone else to join me. Night was falling, so I fixed my bed and hoped that it wouldn't rain. As I slowly drifted to sleep that night, I awoke to an eerie sound. It was like something being dragged in the dirt, right across from where my tent was. Without hesitation, I grabbed whatever I had beside me as a weapon. I clutched it hard into my hands until my knuckles turned white. With the fading light from the embers in my campfire, I could see the shadow being cast across my tent, which meant it was much closer than I thought. It was a very tall, bony shadow. It was quite slender. My adrenaline was kicking in big time. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, trying my best not to give myself away, I began to peek through the small rip in the tent. Immediately, a terrible stench hit me. It was like rot. The smell you're ambushed with if you left the meat in your fridge to rot for weeks and then finally open the door. It was so horrid, I could barely hold back a gag. I may be crazy, but I was not crazy enough to get out of my tent and check out whatever that thing was. Quietly, I laid back down and I waited for the creature to pass. Once it did, and once the smell finally left, I went to sleep. Maybe that's what happens when the adrenaline wears off. The following day, I woke up hoping that whatever that thing was gone still. As I unzipped the tent, I looked around a bit before finally stepping out. That thing had definitely been dragging something. Dirt was drug up from the weight of the object, and there was red fluid in the dirt, a reminder of what I heard last night. And then I saw a piece of wool and realized that thing had probably taken another of my sheep. As the anger built up inside, I reminded myself that I would find this thing and put a stop to it. I began to follow the dragging trail. The red fluid stopped at a large cave dug into the ground. It was lined with old brown pine straw. I wanted to go in, but I knew that would be a bad idea, especially if that's what the creature called its home. I turned around and began to walk back to my tent. I realized I should come back with something I can protect myself better with, as I'd stupidly left everything at the tent. As I'm walking back, everything's more quiet than it was before. The birds have stopped singing, and the wind had even died down. It reminded me to be cautious. As they say, when it all goes quiet, there is a predator around. I slowed my walking down, because whatever it was, I did not want it to hear me. As I continue to walk, I hear a twig crack nearby, and I know for sure that that wasn't me. I slow down and slouch, hoping whatever it was doesn't see me. My heart is practically beating out of my chest at this point. I begin to stand up again, but as soon as I'm all the way up, the creature from last night is standing right in front of me. I've never felt such fear or surprise. I'm frozen there. I'm completely defenseless, looking at something otherworldly. Let me describe it to you as best I can. It's almost human, but not quite. Its skin is a deep gray, like it's lifeless. It's a few feet taller than I am, and I'm nearly 6 feet tall, and its teeth were sharp like daggers. Its hands hang low down to what appear to be knees. It's something straight from a nightmare, and it was only a few feet away from me. I stand completely still, trying not to even breathe. The smell is too awful, though. I'm having trouble keeping my breakfast down. I grab a stick nearby me, and I stare back at the creature. But then everything becomes blurry, then black. When I wake up, I feel like I've been drugged. Maybe it's my mind playing tricks on me. But then I look around. I realize I'm nowhere near my campsite. And if I had to guess, to my horror, I was in that thing's little hole. The one that I was trying to avoid. There were bones everywhere as far as I could see. They were scattered across the floor and lined the walls. I didn't see the creature itself anywhere, and I prayed that it was either gone or much deeper in the cave. As I began to stand up, I suddenly fall. I feel weak, and I have no idea how long I've been out. I begin to hit my legs, pinch them, trying to get the feeling and blood going. so I could leave this godforsaken hole. I was never prepared for something like this. I was panicking big time. Fear of the dark, fear of claustrophobia, fear of that thing being anywhere at any point in time. It had obviously dragged me in here, so it would certainly be back for me. That's when I began to hear the gurgling sound coming from deeper in the cave. My legs are still asleep, but they're getting closer. I'm desperate to stand up now, but I continue to fall every time I try. Closer and closer the sounds come, and I have no way to escape, no way to get further away from them. Then the gurgling sounds stop right behind me. I know it's there. I know it's looking at me, watching me try to escape in futility. I turn and face it, and I'm horrified to see it smiling like it's a person. Then something happened that I still have trouble believing was real. It pointed at me and spoke. Like me. I remember thinking, what does that mean? It could tell that I was obviously afraid of it, and that's something you never want from a predator. It reaches out and grabs me by my ankle before I could yank away. My reaction times are terrible, probably because my legs are asleep. I can't even kick or struggle away from it. Then it stops, turns, lunges at my arm and sinks its teeth into me. It hurts like hell. Somehow, I'm able to pick myself up. I yank myself away from it, and I begin to run out of that cave. When I turn to look, it's running deeper into the cave instead of coming after me. Is it done with me? I run straight out of there. I check my arm, but it apparently didn't break skin. But how in the world had it hurt so much? I continue on, back to my tent to grab my phone. I knew no one would believe me, but I didn't expect them to. What matters now is that I needed help. I find my phone and dial 911. I speak to the operator and tell them where I'm at. I try to keep myself awake, but I'm still feeling wrong and woozy. I pass out again, only to wake up in the hospital now to a nurse, asking me if I'm okay. For a second there, I forgot everything that happened, but as waking up usually does, it all came rushing back into my mind. My eyes widened and my arm began to hurt. I was told that they brought me in with apparent hydration problems, that I passed out from dehydration. Maybe I was in that cave longer than I thought. As I lay there, waiting for when I could be released, I couldn't get that thing's words out of my head. Like me, it had said. What did it mean? Was it simply intelligent enough to know that it looked human? Or was it a warning of something else to come? I'm horrified by it, and to this day I have trouble sleeping thinking about it. I keep an eye out on my animals still, but for some reason, the attacks have stopped, and I haven't seen the creature since. Still, I wish I had never stepped out into those woods. This is what happens when you wear headphones in the woods. From Matilda J. Call me weird or accuse me of defeating the purpose, but whenever I go hiking or camping, I bring a pair of Sony headphones and my smartphone to watch my favorite YouTube channels, and maybe some Netflix or Hulu. Sure, I've nearly walked into a tree a few times, but when you work 12 hours a day, 4 days a week, it can be difficult to find all the time you need to catch up on the videos you enjoy, while also finishing errands and getting outside. The thing is, though, I haven't gone outside wearing headphones for the past year now, and I don't think I ever will again, because something happened to me that was so traumatizing, I nearly never went back in the woods at all. It was July 7th of 2017. I had planned to camp out that day as I had Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays off. It was supposed to be simple and fun. Leave Friday evening, enjoy a Saturday in the woods alone, and come home Sunday so I could get enough sleep for another 12-hour shift on Monday. By 4:30 p.m. that day, I had everything packed, and all my errands had been run for the weekend. It was time to get outdoors and catch up on an overflowing subscription feed near a crackling campfire. Up in those mountains, things are always quiet. I live very close to a highway in the city, so you can imagine how much of a respite it is for me to relax in a place where you can actually hear your ears ringing. I hiked for half an hour before reaching my pre-planned campground, a small clearing surrounded by tall conifers. There was shade and plenty of moist leaves on the ground, and to me that was perfection. I began to pull the bag off of my back and unroll the tent. As I was setting up my nylon shelter, I suddenly froze. I felt something, a strange sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like breathing. Counting down in my head, 3, 2, 1. I then turned around. All I saw around me was forest, empty, silent forest. I sighed and rubbed the newly formed goosebumps on the back of my neck. I then turned back toward the unfinished tent. That was weird, was all I had to say about it. The sun was setting by the time the fire was going. It crackled in front of me, my back to the trees and the tent on the opposite side. I had a single headphone over my head, the other hanging toward the back of my scalp. I was finally able to relax and enjoy myself. I pulled up my subscription feed on the YouTube app, then I kicked off my nighttime bug repellent fueled binge. First up was Dude Perfect. I can't remember the precise video it was, but I do remember just letting it play for a while. I was soon distracted from my sub feed and ended up watching overdramatic bottle flip videos. That's YouTube for you. But that peace didn't last long. I must have been watching videos for about 40 minutes when I found myself petrified, motionless, frozen to my sitting position. I was supposed to be alone in these woods. I hadn't invited anyone out here, nor had I told anyone that I was going camping this weekend. So, when I felt it, I felt like my heart was going to evaporate. There were hands creeping over my shoulders. I remember thinking in my panic, who and why? I remember thinking how much I regretted pointing my back toward the woods. Whoever these hands belonged to, they were icy cold. Every centimeter of their dry, cracked flesh stung like tiny angry waves of red ants. Somehow, I could not move, or I just simply refused to move. In the back of my mind, I knew that jumping or turning around all of a sudden would force my attacker into view. And at that moment, I did not want to see who or what those hands belonged to. They creeped over my shoulders until they were coming down toward my chest. By then, I could see pale white skin and yellow chipped fingernails. They scraped over the outside of my plaid shirt. Nothing had ever felt so gentle, yet so treacherous at the same time. Its movement along my shivering body left a trail of goose flesh. Seconds later, there was a new sensation on the back of my neck, a sensation that was terrifyingly similar to breathing, except these breaths were cold and dry. What must have been 20 seconds spanned eons. Every palpitation of my heart felt like a battering ram against my trembling ribcage. What was I supposed to do? What would a person do in that situation when they missed the opportunity to jump away? When they allowed themselves to be encompassed by an unseen entity in the middle of miles upon miles of wilderness? Shaking violently now, I began to flex my arms. I lifted them slowly, my target the headphones on my head. I will remove them, I thought, and then ask my invader what they wanted from me. My heart pounded somehow harder now, only a few more inches, and then my hands would meet my headphones. The sound of the video playing on my smartphone had now been drowned out by the red noise of blood rushing through my veins. My hands finally met my headphones. I reminded myself I just had to yank them off. Another countdown. 3, 2, 1. I tugged the plastic arch from my head and jumped over the campfire in one spry motion. Turning toward my previous resting place, I breathed in hard. Where I was once sitting only remained struggling shadows lapping at the light of the flickering campfire, and beyond that, trees swayed only just barely in the light wind. What? I breathed out loud. Was it a dream? My mind raced to capture an excuse, but I could find none. After the denial, I found anger as I berated myself, wearing headphones in the woods assuming I was completely safe. If I hadn't been deafened by these headphones, I would have at least heard the assailant enter my camp. But what assailant? Whoever they were gone now, leaving me flustered and considering the idea of just abandoning my weekend plans. I crawled into my tent and sat facing the small opening, the fire still brightly alive in front of me. I stayed awake and aware for the next 2 hours. It took me that long to convince myself that what I just experienced was just a hallucination or something. Yeah, just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion from the long work week and treacherous hike, and aided by me wearing headphones to listen to miscellaneous tripe on the internet. Having thoroughly persuaded myself that there was nothing to worry about, I laid back, still facing the opening of the tent, where the fire could be seen outside. Then I went back to taking in my sub-feed. Shane Dawson began to pour in through my headphones. I was warm, comfortable, and entertained. It was only a matter of minutes before I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me up. My right hand was still propping up my smartphone, which by then had strayed quite far from my subscription feed again. I must have been out for an hour or so. It was still dark out. Actually, it was darker now, as the flames of the fire that once imbued my tent with warmth and a secure glow had died down to not more than orange radiating embers. It gave off some light though, enough light for me to see that I was not alone. I held my breath. The sound of me breathing in would surely give me away. That is, if they didn't already know I was there. Sitting on the opposite side of the campfire was a small, feminine figure. She seemed to shake a bit every few seconds. Because of her dirty, mud-covered hair hanging in front of her face, I could not make out much more than her kneeling, quivering shape. She wasn't wearing clothes, from what I could tell, but the mud on her body had long since dried, forming a body paint-like covering about her. She could have been looking at me, and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Realizing that my headphones were still on, I quietly removed them and realized that it wasn't as silent as it appeared. Every time the girl shook, she moaned a raspy cry. She had been sobbing this whole time. This dirty, strange little girl was in my camp sobbing in the middle of the forest. My fear subsided for a moment. Human instinct kicked in as I wondered if this poor girl needed help. Perhaps she was the source of my fears from before, and my sudden jump had scared her back into the woods. Driven by guilt and anxiety, I pulled myself up, placing my smartphone and headphones beside me. But when my shoulder rubbed against the side of the tent, her face immediately cocked up. She was looking straight at me. Her face shone clearly in the embers' glow. I screamed. The girl had only eyes, No mouth, no nose, just eyes that poured tears over her far too smooth face. I was crawling backward now, hitting the back wall of the tent. I ended up tearing a hole through it to get away desperately from her. Clumsily, I got myself stuck in the hole, and I struggled for a bit before standing outside the remnants of the shelter. I turned toward the girl, but she was gone now. She had disappeared, yet her cries remained in the air. They echoed distantly through the trees around me. The sobbing now sounded as if it were miles away. There was no possible way I could make sense of this situation, and all my mind could compel me to do was flee, escape. So I gave in. I made it back to my car without any further incidents, without any further life-shattering sounds or sights. Relief was the only sensation left in me. Everything was numb now. I just wanted to go home. After this experience, I'd need a whole new weekend, just to escape this failure of a weekend. As I climbed into my car and put the keys into the ignition, I looked up. No, I didn't see the girl again, nor did I hear her anymore. But that was when I did realize something. I'd forgotten my phone and headphones in my rush. The ruins of my tent were there too, an epitome of my experience. I floored the gas pedal and didn't let up until I made it home. I haven't planned any further trips into the woods, and the most I've done is hike on already busy hiking trails, and one thing I no longer do is wear headphones outside. Call it a nonsensical phobia, but I think it's more than that. Take this as a warning. If you ever find yourself in the woods listening to something in your headphones, be careful. You're never quite alone. And if you ever stumble upon a quickly abandoned campsite with an old pair of Sony headphones lying there, turn around and leave. Leave before you hear her crying. Eyes in the Woods, from J. Min. Location: West Dover, Vermont. For context, this happened during the first week of August in 2016. It must have been around the same time as the Brazil Summer Olympics. Every kid growing up gets the feeling that they're being watched in the middle of the night, that there's a monster under their bed. Their parents would show them that there was nothing there to be afraid of, assure them that monsters do not exist, and that would be the end of things. I was one of those kids. Every night before I went to sleep, I would check under my bed and look inside my closet to make sure nothing was there. After I would determine that they were both clear, I would go to sleep. I grew out of that constant fear and dismissed the idea of monsters, but I never thought that fear would one day catch up to me. It was a bright summer day in West Dover, Vermont. I was on a weekend getaway with two of my closest friends, Jay and Dan. We were all 16 at the time, getting ready to start our junior years of high school in 3 weeks. Our families are very close, and Jay's family offered a trip to the rest of us. Jay's grandfather owns a cabin along the edge of the Dover County forest, right next to Cheney Brook. They would use the house in the winter during the ski season, whenever they wanted to ski on Mount Snow, which overlooks the valley. It was particularly cool that August morning, only getting to about 66 degrees by midday. My friends and I are very avid hikers, and a small trail, no longer than 6 miles long, goes right past the cabin. Seeing this as an opportunity to get away from our families, we packed up a tent, sleeping bags, and some other essentials, then headed out onto the trail. We made our way to the trailhead on the other side of the development and turned back around at about 4 p.m. We got about 4 miles in on the walk back and decided to set up camp as it was getting dark. We found a clearing on the side of the trail and got to work. I built a fire pit out of rocks I found in the area, while Jay and Dan gathered sticks to build a fire. We got the fire going around 7:30 and started cooking the hot dogs that we had brought with us. We turned on some music, shared a few stories, and overall we were having a great time. Jay brought 3 beers from the fridge in the cabin, so each of us cracked one open and sipped on them while we were eating. The fire began to dim around 8:30, so we all went to grab some more sticks. While I was collecting sticks, the speaker stopped playing music since my phone's Bluetooth was out of range. For a few minutes, I got a chance to listen to the natural sounds of the wilderness. However, there were no sounds. No birds chirping, no crickets making noise, not even a breeze making the leaves rattle. It was absolutely silent. I felt uneasy and made my way back to camp. The whole time I was walking back, I felt as though I was being watched, and a chill ran down my spine. Once I made it back to the fire with my kindling, I could see a look of confusion on Jay's face. He was watching the opposite way of me when I got back, and he seemed confused to see me when he turned around. "How did you get behind me so fast? I was just talking to you a second ago over there." He pointed off in the direction that he had been staring in when I came back, and I assured him that I wasn't over there. "Well, what did you need help with then? You kept saying, 'Help me.'" At this point, I was shaken. No one else was on the trail with us at that time of night, and Dan was only a couple of meters away from me when we were collecting sticks, so I knew that it wasn't Dan trying to mess around with Jay. At this point, Dan came back, and we all just decided that it was nothing. We didn't play any music at this point, and the sounds of the wild sparked back up. A good hour went by, and we all felt pretty tired by this point. Dan went into the tent. Jay and I were getting ready to put the fire out. Then it happened again. The woods went silent, and I immediately got chills. Jay and I didn't like the vibe in the area, and we were hesitant to stay out, but we did anyway. "Hey!" Jay and I both turned around fast. A voice called out from the tree line. We were startled. "Help me." The voice called out again. "Help me." The voice was deep and distorted, and it just didn't sound right. Jay and I were on edge, and Dan had just come back out of the tent. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We were all looking off into the tree line for about 15 more minutes, but whatever was there got quiet. Jay turned on the video camera that he brought with him and began filming the tree line to see if he could spot something, anything. Suddenly, we heard a shriek. The sound was unlike any animal I'd ever heard. It started off similar to an elk's call, but there was a human nature to it, like a person screaming with the voice. We all stood up. Again, we heard the shriek, only this time it was closer. Terrified, we all jumped into the tent. I knew that whatever was out there was no elk, because elk in that area are not very common, and they have a higher, more consistent pitch than this thing screeching. We heard the shriek again. Luckily, it did not seem as close as the one before. All of us went into panic mode, looking to each other for answers and a way to get out of this situation. At this point, Dan opened the tent door. He got out of the tent and began to run. Jay and I exchanged looks and followed him down the trail. We were running faster than we had ever run before. All of us were experienced in cross-country, so we all knew how to pace ourselves. The only difference here was the sheer adrenaline running through our bodies, changing our mindsets, and instead of pacing ourselves, we made ourselves run as fast as possible. The sky was clear. The moon was almost full, its light cascading through the canopy, lighting up the trail. The entire time we ran, we could hear rustling in the brush behind us with the eventual groan of whatever was chasing us. About a mile away from the trailhead, We were all pretty tired and began to slow down. At this point, we heard something dart right past us in the brush. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. We all stopped in our tracks. None of us knew what was going on, and I had never had so much fear in my life. We saw a shadow dart across the trail in front of us, and once it went back into the brush, we ran again. It almost sounded like it was circling us as it followed us back to the cabin. It only took us 12 minutes to cover the 2 miles of trail to the cabin, and as soon as we made it to the trailhead, we took off towards the cabin. We made it to the door, ran inside, and locked the door behind us. We then frantically ran to every door and window in the cabin, making sure they were locked. Jay's parents, who were the only ones up at the time, did not understand why we were back so early from our hike, but before they could ask us any questions, there was a thud on the roof. Everyone grew quiet. There was a second thud, then 2 quick ones, progressively moving towards the deck. The thuds turned into the sound of footsteps, and then it stopped. Anxiously, we all watched the deck to see what would jump down, but I don't think any of us were expecting to see what we did. A loud crash came from the deck, and in front of us was a man who did not look right. It looked like he hadn't eaten in months, made up of only skin and bones. His eyes were pale and glazed over. He was almost bald with only a few strands of hair on the top of his head. His hair was silver, making him look old in addition to the wrinkles in his skin. His skin was as white as snow, and he was completely undressed. He seemed much taller than any man that I'd seen before. However, I couldn't tell you exactly how tall he was. He was on all fours. At that moment, I realized that what was on the other side of the screen glass door was not a man at all. It didn't even look human. It stared right through the glass at us, its pale, lifeless eyes not blinking or moving an inch. All of us looked right back at it, horrified. It screeched loudly, then jumped back onto the roof with ease, and we never saw it again. All of us were too scared to go to sleep, and once the sun came back out, we felt a sense of security that we hadn't felt that night. Jay had recorded the majority of the encounter, and after going through the tape multiple times, we were still at a loss for words. We never went back for our stuff on the trail that weekend, and a year later during the winter, we hiked back out to find that some of it was still there. However, we did not go unarmed. I wasn't a big believer of the paranormal before then. I would go urban exploring with the guys a lot before that, and we would see and hear things that we could never explain. But that stuff was easily ignored. This was different. This was real. It was tangible. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. I don't think I can ever unsee that thing or get it out of my mind. We got lucky that day. I've had trouble going back into those woods ever since, and I've been hesitant to stay at the cabin during ski season. Jay's grandfather has changed the locks since then, so I feel a bit safer than before. But part of me always feels as though someone is watching whenever I'm up there. Other encounters with something similar to what we saw have happened all over Vermont, and from what we found, it most accurately describes a Wendigo. The Wendigo is a legend created by the Algonquin people to deter those in the tribe from falling into the grasp of greed and to deter those who craved human flesh. But every legend has its truth. I can't be sure that what I saw was a Wendigo, but the description and similarities, they're uncanny. But whatever we saw may be, it still haunts me to this day, and I don't think I'll ever go back into those woods. Deep Woods Wendigo Encounter. From Your Worst Nightmare. Location, New York. I found myself on an expedition deep into the forest. To be more precise, it was the High Peaks Wilderness, which is an area within the Adirondacks. Brought along a buddy of mine, who you can call Trailmaster, and a friend of mine named Nymph. The trails here are endless, beautiful mountain ranges filled with mile after mile of dense woods, the true definition of beautiful and dangerous. After hiking for most of the day, we must have traveled just under 3.5 miles. Trailmaster found a good spot for us to settle down for the night. A slight breeze was blowing in from the northeast as the sun was on the verge of setting. We'd have at least 2.5 hours of daylight left. Trailmaster set out to gather wood, and Nymph went to collect water from a nearby creek. I worked on setting up our 3 tents for the night. All of a sudden, Nymph came running back to camp without the canteens. The sound of her panting, followed by her dropping to the dirt on her knees, was enough to leave me in awe. Believe me when I say I know Nymph, and it's unusual for her to be panting like that. I did my best to calm her down while trying to get answers. "What's the matter?" I asked. Just as Trailmaster returned with a bundle of sticks. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. This is what Nymph told us. She had just arrived at the creek and found a good spot. Just as she began filling the canteens, the cliché sound of a twig snapping was heard. The sound was enough to startle her. The sound originated from the other side of the creek. She brushed it aside as an animal probably spooked by her presence and kept filling. Then she heard it again, except the sound was louder and seemed much closer this time. It caught her by surprise, and she was forced by instinct to look in the direction the sound had come from. What she heard next was an audible grunting sound, the type a male white-tailed deer might take. The feeling of dread washed upon her. She felt as if she should not be there. Then there was the feeling of her being watched. It made her extremely uncomfortable, almost to the point of being disoriented. She rose to her feet and took a few steps back. What she then saw across the creek chilled her. Partially obstructed by trees, a pair of antlers and what looked to be legs, hind legs, stood. She could hear a loud grunting coming from behind the trees. She thought it was a deer. Her better judgment kicked in though, and she thought to herself, what deer around these parts isn't afraid of being so close to a human? She ran back to camp when the grunts became louder and started to sound almost threatening. "Are you sure of this story?" Trailmaster asked with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Nymph didn't even answer him, instead giving him a cold stare. "It was most likely a deer. Are you afraid of a deer?" said Trailmaster. I, on the other hand, gave Nymph the benefit of the doubt. Nymph, even in her current state, was capable of describing what she saw, heard, and felt. It was her senses and gut feeling that made her run away. Trailmaster opted to go take a look at that area where Nymph had been. Nymph was reluctant, she would not go back, so Trailmaster set out alone. Nymph and I stayed at camp, all while I was debating whether or not we should relocate. But first, I would wait for Trailmaster to get back. When Trailmaster arrived at the area of the creek where Nymph had been, this is what he observed. Footprints, which looked like Nymph's, headed in the direction of our camp, and empty canteens were scattered across the ground. On the other side of the creek, there were prints resembling an animal, maybe a deer. The only problem, though, was the spacing of the prints, and how something about them appeared missing or wrong. A deer typically walks on all fours, but upon closer inspection, Trailmaster came up with the conclusion that this deer had probably been walking on 2 legs. The prints formed a trail, and the trail seemed to have emerged somewhere in the woods. It continued for a few meters, stopped at the opposite edge of the creek, then turned around and headed back in the direction they originated from, without overlapping the original set. Trailmaster later did admit that it spooked him a bit, and he felt uneasy about it. He arrived back at camp half an hour later with our filled canteens. As for our camp, even if we wanted to move, it would be nearly impossible, as the sun was already setting. Fast forward 2.5 hours, Our tents were pitched, the campfire was lit, and dinners were being served. But due to today's events, we decided that one of us should stay awake while the others slept. It was just too dark to move at the moment. My tent was only a foot away from Nymph's, and there was a good reason for that. Trailmaster's tent had been pitched a good 5 meters away because he's a light sleeper, but we had to move his tent closer to ours. The perimeter of our camp was set with a trap which would sound if someone tripped the wire. It was some tin cans and fishing line. Primitive, but it worked. Nymph didn't say much more about the incident that night, and I don't blame her. She was still shaken up, even with my promise to keep her safe. Trailmaster's findings at the creek only made things more worrisome. Thinking about what Nymph saw and what Trailmaster found made me uneasy. The darkness around us, followed by the eerie silence of the woods and the uncertainty of what's out there, it was unsettling. The sound of burning wood was the only sound loud enough to distract us from sudden faint sounds in the distance. The mind can play tricks on you. That night, it seemed like a dark figure was always standing a few meters outside our camp, just beyond the light's reach. Every rustle in the bush was something trying to sneak up on us. Every sound had a source. It's those sounds that make a night in the woods so magical or terrifying. Trailmaster and Nymph were asleep, and I was on watch. The sounds of crickets at night was nature's lullaby, which was on the verge of putting me to sleep myself, when all of a sudden, it all stopped. I realized I had fallen asleep for a while on watch. Nymph said that she had awoken sometime during the early hours of the morning, around 0400. She found both myself and Trailmaster out. The air outside of the tent was filled with a putrid smell. She described it as rotting flesh. It seemed to linger. A weeks-old carcass already in the stages of decomposition. It was that bad, she said. Nymph, alarmed by the smell, woke both of us up. We obviously had not smelled anything hours before. I did a check of the perimeter and found nothing out of the ordinary. We did feel as if we were being watched, which itself was quite overwhelming. The smell, though, faded within the hour, but only after we made some noise. It was only during first light about 2 hours later did we notice it. Prints from what I assumed to be of a deer just a few meters away. Trailmaster confirmed that these were identical to the prints he had found by the creek. Trailmaster said that it was probably just a random deer. Though what I found weird was the way the prints were spread out. They appeared to pace back and forth for a while, then took off vertically. Trailmaster then noted that there seemed to be a missing pair of hoof prints. It was just hind legs again. But there was no mistaking that the prints were definitely from a deer. What made me feel uneasy was the zigzag pattern of the footprints, which were strikingly similar to the way a human walks. Trailmaster was tempted to follow the set of footprints, which headed in another direction. Nymph was hysterical and had no intention of doing such a thing. She said that the whole ordeal just seemed odd and downright creepy. A freaking deer creature, weird prints, and not to mention the stench. Whatever it was appeared to be following us, and we had no intention of meeting it. I urged Trailmaster to forget about it. Instead, we should just keep moving. "Third time's the charm," I said. "Let's not be around for it." We were on the move for most of the day. Nymph was still terrified. Trailmaster did not experience the same feelings, hence why he opted to go investigate the prints before. He seemed fine being on point. Nymph admitted how she thought the creature was still following us. I told her to stay close. I don't know what made her think that, but I knew better than to doubt her. If that creature had been following us, it probably followed at a distance. Then again, nothing would be more terrifying than to suddenly turn around and see a pair of antlers sticking out from behind a tree, or for one of us to be singled out in the middle of nowhere. Despite all that had happened, we managed to reach our destination unscathed. All seemed quiet. Any and all feelings of dread vanished, as well as the feeling of being watched. The atmosphere felt lighter as we moved out of the area. Perhaps we were in its territory, so it felt the need to make its presence known. But we no longer felt threatened. Nothing else significant happened that's worth mentioning. I think we got lucky on that trip. Whatever it was, perhaps it decided to spare us, or perhaps it was just curious. We simply don't know. I'd like to think that it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers who venture off the trail into the vast unknown. Be careful in the woods. Rougarou, from Warning Page 803. Location, Hayden, Alabama. Read by Stories, Fables, and Ghostly Tales.
My grandmother's farm was situated on 15 acres of land north of Hayden, Alabama. It was several hours from our home, and we would make the drive there a handful of times a year, mostly in the summers. I can remember the anticipation I would feel as we drove up the long driveway to find the modest house, which my grandfather Elmer had built with his bare hands, perched atop the hill. Picturing it now, I see the rusted tin roof, the weathered porch, and the dilapidated barn that stood out back. As a child, none of that mattered to us, obviously. We spent our days roaming the rolling countryside, swimming in a nearby creek and playing on the old oak that grew beside the house, whose branches were so large they scraped the ground. The fields surrounding the farmed house were no longer fertile, providing ample space for us to properly conduct the adventures we concocted in our minds, and were surrounded by the dense forests of the Alabama countryside. I always cherished the time I spent with my grandmother. When we were inside, she was always singing to us, telling us stories about when she was a girl, teaching us how to make things out of sticks and string, and passing down the type of random wisdom that only a grandmother can. Unfortunately, I never knew my grandfather. My grandmother said he died in a hunting accident when I was very young. I heard so much about him from her and my parents, however, that I felt like I knew him. He was a large man, strong as an ox, my grandmother would say, who would farm the fields from sunup to sundown, without so much as a whisper of a complaint. My grandmother, her family of Cajun descent, had met my grandfather at school in Louisiana, and the two had moved out to this land, left to them by Elmer's uncle, to start a life together. My mother had been born in this very farmhouse. I respected my grandmother more than any other person on the earth. She was not without her quirks, the strangest of which was her insistence that we follow 3 specific rules as long as we were there. I can remember her pulling my sister and I close, kissing us on the forehead, and gently reminding us about them each time we arrived, her frail and wrinkled hands cradling ours. Don't leave food outside. No singing past dark, and most importantly, never go into the woods. She never explained why they were important, only that they were important. The rules were something we rarely questioned. Grandma said to follow them, so we did. Simple as that. The first 2 were pretty easy. I wasn't much of a singer, and we didn't have food outside unless my grandmother had given it to us. But the third was a bit more challenging. Her property was surrounded by woods on all sides, with a buffer of several hundred yards between the house and the tree line, and my sister and I were often tempted to go exploring within. We'd ask permission, stating our ages as proof that we were responsible and could take care of ourselves. Without fail, she would always reply, "The rules are for your safety, Shah. You mustn't break them." Shah is a Cajun word that means dear. For the sake of clarity, I'm translating the rest of her Cajun speak into regular English for this account. I can remember one evening, when my sister was only 3 or 4 years old, when she accidentally left some food outside. We had been eating bologna sandwiches on the back steps. I remember we both liked ours smashed down and cut into little squares. Having finished mine, I had gone inside to get something to drink, and she had followed me, leaving her plate behind. Later that night, we were all in front of the fireplace, curled up in Grandma's lap under one of her large quilts, telling stories and laughing when we heard something scratching at the back door. Immediately, I felt her body tense underneath me, and she shot a glance over to my father, who was sitting on the floor. He tried to keep her face blank, but I could see the worry creeping through. "What is that, Grandma?" I asked. "Probably just a raccoon." "Probably just a raccoon," my father said, starting to stand. "Sha, let me," Grandma said. My father picked us up from her lap, gently placed us on the floor as she made her way to the back of the house. A few moments later, she walked back into the den and sat back down. She was holding my sister's empty plate from earlier. When my sister saw the plate and the look on my grandmother's face, she burst into tears. "It's okay," she said, hugging my sister tightly. "Let's do our best not to do this again, okay?" Later that night, when everyone was in bed, I crept out from beneath the covers and tiptoed to the back door. It was open. I don't think the house had air conditioning, and the doors were often left open with the screen doors closed to keep the bugs out. I was old enough to be curious about what happened earlier, and young enough to not be scared about what I might find. There was a single bulb above the back door that cast a narrow beam of light that illuminated the back steps. On the top 2 steps, bathed in the eerie light of the dim bulb, were dozens of long, black hairs. After the food incident, I became a bit more aware about the things that happened around the farmhouse, and started to have the notion that my grandmother was hiding something. I wasn't sure what it was, but whatever was at the back door was part of it. The next year, my sister and I found a dead deer about 50 yards in from the tree line. I think it was a deer at least. Its head was completely missing, and its body was completely mutilated. Even at my young age, I knew no other animal had done that. When I told my grandmother about it, rather than being shocked, she acted as if it was commonplace, saying to stay away from it, and that my father would take it away somewhere. The next year, there was one night where we were all woken by something banging around in the barn. In the morning, when we went out to investigate, it was clear that someone had vandalized it. One of the barn doors was completely ripped off of the front, and everything inside was torn apart, like someone was looking for something. Grandma said it must have been thieves looking for iron to scrap. But what thief would go looking for iron in a barn in the middle of nowhere? Later that same trip, as I was playing on the old oak, I noticed my sister had strayed rather close to the tree line. The next thing I knew, I saw my father sprinting across the fields towards her. When he reached her, he grabbed her, threw her over his shoulder, and sprinted back towards the farmhouse. He had scared the shit out of her, so I guess that's why she was crying hysterically. But my father never would say why he had to get her away from there so quickly. There were other incidents like that over the years, but what they meant in some I had never figured out. The last time I visited my grandmother's farm was the summer I turned 16. It was the summer my grandmother finally told me about the secret she had been keeping for so long. At 16, as most kids are, I was pretty defiant. I still had great respect for my grandmother, don't get me wrong, but I was growing a bit tired of the seemingly arbitrary nature of her rules, especially the third one. Never go into the woods. What was I? 5? By that time, I had basically run out of things to do at the farm, and wanted desperately to explore the woods I had been barred from entering for so long. So one day, I did. It was an exceptionally hot July day, and I decided to follow the little creek that wound through the corner of our property into the woods. The foliage was dense and unforgiving, blocking out much of the sun and providing much needed respite from the heat. I kicked my shoes off and began walking along the creek's sandy bay, losing myself in the hum of the water as it rushed around various sticks and stones and the chatter of the birds and insects around me. When I had gone far enough that I couldn't see the tree line, I noticed that aside from the sound of the water, I couldn't hear the sounds of the birds or insects any longer. The forest had become deathly silent. The air was unnaturally still, creating an odd sense of uneasiness within me. Never forgetting my grandmother's warnings and believing I had somehow worn out my welcome, I hastily turned to head back to the farmhouse. I stopped when I heard the crack of a branch far off in the distance behind me. Afraid to look back, I started walking again. A few steps later, I heard it again. It was the sound of someone or something moving through dense underbrush in my direction. I turned slowly, and what I saw scared the living shit out of me. In the distance, I saw the silhouette of some lumbering beast walking towards me through the forest. It was tall, over 6 feet, and looked mostly like a man, except there appeared to be ears sprouting from the top of its dark head. I could see its eyes, large and yellow, shining at me even though the rest of its head was shrouded in darkness. I stumbled backwards, falling into the sandy water, then turned and tore through the woods, sprinting over rocks and pine cones and briars in a mad dash to escape whatever was coming for me. I didn't even bother stopping to grab my shoes. When I made it back to the farmhouse, I slammed the outer door and locked it shut, then ran inside to find my grandmother. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, preparing some beans for dinner. I was a mess. I was covered in sweat, wet and sandy, and I'm sure my eyes belayed my terror. When she looked up at me, she could tell immediately that something had happened. "Were you in the woods?" was all she asked. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I didn't know. There was a thing. I stumbled over my words, not sure exactly what to say to her. Instead of being angry, she looked at me with sadness in her eyes and motioned for me to come and sit beside her. My foot was bleeding, and once she had bandaged it up, she began to tell me a story. The loup garou is what you saw. It's also called a rougarou outside of Louisiana, I believe. My mother used to tell me the tales about a monster, part man and part wolf, that would roam the swamps around her home and snatch children who had strayed too far from their parents. A children's fable, surely, which I never really believed it to be true, yet the stories still scare me. It wasn't until we moved here to the farm that I realized it wasn't just a story. Your grandfather, on one of his hunting trips, found the carcass of an animal that had been ripped to shreds, beyond recognition. He hunted the animal he believed had caused it, thinking it was a bear, and finally tracked it to its den deep in the forest. It was no bear, child. Your grandfather described it as a man with long dark hair covering his body, yet with the head of a wolf, just like the stories. The two fought, your grandfather prevailing, but not before being gravely injured. Several hours after he came back that night, a sickness overtook him. He wailed and moaned in his sleep that night, and in the morning his eyes had sunken into his head, and the hair on his body had started to grow long and deep black. A few hours later, he was gone. I guess he had realized what was happening and didn't want to endanger me. The thing you saw today in the forest, child, that was your grandfather. My heart was broken, having lost the only man I had ever loved. I didn't know how to cope with it. I would sit out on the back steps and sing old songs that my mother would sing to me, and I would see him, or rather it, would creep out of the forest to listen, only coming close enough to show me that he was there. I would leave food out on the back steps at night, and he would come and eat, always licking the plate clean. I don't think the transformation was complete then. Your grandfather was still there inside, somewhere. I hope he could somehow come back from whatever he had become. Then I started to hear the howling and find the dead animals. That's when I knew your grandfather was gone. The rules, now you can see, are meant to protect you, child. He is drawn to the food and to the singing, still remembering how I confronted him during those early days. And anything that goes into the woods doesn't come out alive. I'm thankful you're here. This must be your last trip here, child. Now that he has seen you close up, he will have a taste for your blood, and he won't stop until he drains every last bit from your body. Your grandfather has several guns here, but I dare not use them, and I caution you to heed this warning. I see the look in your eyes. If you did succeed in killing him, I fear you would face the same fate as your grandfather. If the old tales are true, he who kills the Rougarou eventually becomes one.
A woman named Cassie. From Keene. Location, New Mexico. I come from a reservation in southeast New Mexico. Every year we have a ceremonial celebration that is open to the public. Traditional crown dancers, performances of other tribes, parades, music, a rodeo, and a good crowd. There was nothing unusual compared to other years prior. But like any big event, some planning and safety precautions are to be considered beforehand. Little did I know that I was going to be a part of this event. The tribal vice president had personally asked me if I could be the head of the security detail in charge of guarding the livestock for the bull riders and performers at the rodeo grounds. I agreed to the job. It was only 4 days long, had good pay, and it was the night shift. That was a relief, because it meant it was going to be nice and quiet. I was wrong, though. To this day, I rarely attend the events anymore, as I may just run into this creature again. It was July 5th, 2015, the second night of the celebration. It had been raining and I was drenched. Being a U.S. Marine, you could say that I was used to being out into the elements. At a certain point, it finally stopped raining. I had a team of 6 people that night, and they were finally beginning to show up. They didn't have security experience, but beggars can't be choosers. They were on their routine patrols in no time, and I was soon by myself, checking on them from time to make sure they were doing what they were supposed to. They were talking, laughing, and telling jokes a lot, but with it being quiet out, I let them be, to help them pass the time. The clouds broke, exposing a full white moon. It allowed us to see much better that night. I noticed in the northwest corner of the parking lot a yellow Toyota. One of my teammates came to me, Linda, I think, and was a little concerned because they were drinking. I told Linda just to leave them be. Our concern was the bulls, horses, and other animals in the corrals. She agreed and resumed her patrol. It was 11:47 p.m. All was still quiet in the darkness, when a voice in the distance pierced the silence. "Cassie! Cassie, where are you?" It was the occupants of the parked Toyota in the parking lot. Irritated, I went to see what the problem was. I encountered them near the bleachers and asked if everything was all right. They were obviously drinking and seemed quite concerned. They introduced themselves as father and son, Tom being the son and Frank the father. I gave them my name and asked a second time what was wrong. "She's gone, sir. Just gone. She disappeared, like a skinwalker," I remember thinking. Yeah, right. But I kept that to myself. I set them down on the bleachers and told them to wait right there with the rest of my team. I strapped my LED light to my head, and I told one of my team members, Barry, to open the gate and make his way back in case law enforcement was called. He took his Suburban and did what I told him to. I looked at the 2 men who were still feeling scared. I told them to tell me what happened and to be serious this time. "We were having some beers, just having a good time. I turned around and she was gone. I didn't hear her get out of my car and I didn't hear anything," Tom said. I am skeptical because they were intoxicated, but to put them at ease, I said I'd take a look. The car was parked near a tree line about 75 yards where I was. I turned on my LED headlight and I made my way up to the car. There were empty beer cans all over the place, front and rear of the car, and 3 windows rolled down, indicating to me that someone was in the back. As I said before, it had rained that night, so I looked down out of the car, and there were shoe prints in the mud. They went into the tree line. I thought maybe she went to the bathroom or got sick. I followed the shoe prints. They went about 25 yards into the tree line. My LED lights were very bright, so I could make out the prints very easily. Then I stopped, because the shoe prints just vanished. They ended in one spot and didn't return. No tracks leading back to the car either. Just nothing. They're obviously way too intoxicated, I thought. I circled around and made my way down to the car. I searched the car one more time and again it was empty. This time, right when I turned around, I heard a loud hissing noise, almost like a cat's, but oddly different. There was an undertone like a low scream blended with the hissing. I looked, and 10 feet away was a massive black cat. It was a little over the size of a full-grown golden retriever. This cat had huge paws that looked more like hands covered in fur, and its eyes were human in shape, not like a feline's. Its front legs were deformed looking, as if they were broken in the same places on each side. Patches of fur were missing, and its skin was mangy. I could smell it. It smelled pungent and rotten. It stared at me with orange-reddish eyes. It appeared to be daring me to move. I knew this cat was no normal feline. As I looked into those eyes, it felt like something was trying to take over my thoughts in my head. My mind kept getting darker and darker, as if I was being hypnotized. I closed my eyes and shook my head. I looked at another part of it besides its eyes, and slowly my thoughts came too. I had my K-bar, and I reached for it, unbuttoning the handle. That's when the strangest thing happened. It looked at my hand on the blade. It appeared to recognize it as a weapon. It arched its back and, crazy enough, stood up on 2 legs. I withdrew the K-bar, waiting for this thing to attack, but it walked backwards like a person, never taking its eyes off me. It backed away into the tree line, standing on all 4s again, then ran into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Now I'm a veteran, decorated too, but that was the first time I was truly scared in almost 13 years. I called Barry over the radio. I told him to pick up Tom and Frank and take them to the police substation. He drove up in his Suburban, flashing his spotlight into the tree line. He came up to me and was concerned because I seemed confused, and I had a hard time finishing my sentences, as my mind was obviously jumbled. Then he asked me a question that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you see the girl? She was standing in the trees. I shined my spotlight on her, and she kept looking at you. She took a few steps and seemed to just disappear in the bushes, as if she squatted down. That's why I was checking the tree line before I got here." "Boss, you okay?" "No," I said. "Just take Tom and Frank and take them to the station. Then get back here fast. Take Linda with you. No one goes alone." "Sure thing, boss. I'm on it," he replied. Barry and Linda returned to find the team all on the bleachers. I waited for them to arrive until I could say anything. "Here's what's going down. We split into teams of 2, 3 people a team. No one is patrolling by themselves tonight, and I want radio checks every 15 minutes from everyone. Stay in the light when you can, and stay away from the tree line in the northwest corner. Do you understand?" All confused as to the sudden change in my demeanor, they agreed. Thank God, we finished the night without another incident. Then they began pestering me about what I saw, and I finally told them. They started telling me about their experiences as well. Many of them claimed to have seen a woman. She was walking around the grounds. The animals would act weird around her. Horses would kick the fences when she got close, and bulls would bang their heads against the corrals in an attempt to get at her. They attempted to talk to the girl, but all they could get from her was, "My name is Cassie." Needless to say, I wasn't going to sleep that night. I decided to watch the rodeo as the day shift arrived. I said nothing more about my experience, and I told the team not to speak of it. Then the rodeo started. Huge crowd, loud noise, and cheering. Then I walk right into them, Tom and Frank again, and this time It's who I assume must be Cassie. Tom and Frank say hello. I told them I'm glad they're doing okay, and then I see the woman. You must be Cassie, I say. She looked at me for a few seconds, and those eyes, they were the same orange-reddish eyes I saw in that creature. Yeah, this is Cassie, Tom said. I felt strange that Cassie said nothing, but I noticed Tom was doing all the talking for her. Yet every word he spoke, Cassie kind of swayed slightly back and forth. Cassie, are you okay? I asked. Once again, Tom spoke for her. Yeah, she's fine, thank you. I said okay. Enjoy your day. And oddly, as they walked away, they turned in unison, walking in the same manner, their legs synchronized. Yet under my breath, and even with the scores of people making such noise, I quietly said, I know what you are. Now, Cassie and only Cassie turned toward me. It was like she heard every word I whispered. She smiled, then turned and walked away, driving away in their Toyota. I never believed in skinwalkers before, but I stood face to face with one of those creatures. The Navajo believe in these beasts. I'm not Navajo, I'm Apache, but skinwalkers, oh, they're very, very real. The story you're about to hear gave me chills. Have you ever wondered why humans seem overly cautious about the remains of other humans? Why we not only bury the dead, but avoid walking over their graves, let alone their remains? This story sent to me by M. Brosnan is titled The Bone Field, and it might explain this universal custom of honoring our dead. Because every action has a reaction, whether you're alive or dead. I'm 64 years old now, lived on the same piece of Oklahoma dirt my whole life, and I expect I'll die on it too. That's not a complaint. I've had a good run, raised 3 kids who turned out better than I probably deserved, stayed married to the same beautiful woman for 41 years, and managed to keep the farm going through droughts and floods and everything in between. Most men would call that a blessed life, and I'd agree with them. But there are things that happened here. Things my immediate family kept just between us. And these days we don't talk about it much anymore. My wife, Carol, gets this look in her eye whenever the subject gets close to surfacing. A sort of distant, haunted look. And I notice steer the conversation elsewhere quick. Some memories don't get softer with time. Some of them stay sharp as the day they cut you. I'm only typing this down now because I'm old enough to know that memories fade, whether we want them to or not. And this one, well, it needs to be remembered. Not because I want to relive it, God knows I don't, but because it happened. It was real, and I think there's something wrong about carrying it to my grave without ever setting it down in words. This would have been the summer of 1994. I was in my mid-30s. The years blur together when you're working as hard as I was back then. Carol had been diagnosed with lupus about 3 years prior, and that summer was one of her bad stretches. Some weeks she'd be up and around, almost her normal self, helping with meals and keeping an eye on the kids. Other weeks the disease would flare up something awful, and she'd be bedridden for days at a time. It made her joints swell up. She'd be exhausted right down to her bones, running fevers that would spike out of nowhere. I won't pretend it wasn't hard. I was working the fields from sunup to sundown, then coming home to cook dinner, helping the kids with their schoolwork, and making sure Carol had her medications. Then I'd have to check on the livestock. I'd fall into bed around 11 or 12 most nights, and be back up at 5 to start all over again. But here's the thing. I wasn't unhappy. Not for a single moment. I had a wife I loved, 3 kids who meant the world to me, and land that had been in my family for 3 generations. Every tired muscle, every sleepless night, and every moment of worry about Carol's health. It was all worth it. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, which is something you should know before I tell you what happened, because otherwise you might think this story broke me somehow. It didn't. It scared me worse than anything in my life, but it didn't break me. My 2 older boys, Kenneth and Leonard, we called him Lenny, they were 14 and 13 that summer, respectively. Good kids, the 2 of them. Kenneth was the serious one and always had been. He took after his mom in that way, usually thoughtful and quiet. He'd rather read a book than roughhouse with friends. But Lenny was different. Lenny had an energy about him, a brightness to him. He was a laugher, and he loved to get a rise out of his older brother, which was awfully easy. I think Lenny knew which buttons to press. The 2 of them helped me with farm work when they weren't in school, and they took turns looking after their little sister Beverly, who was 7 at the time. Beverly was a sweet kid, quiet like her mother too, but with more of a stubborn streak that I recognized from my own father. She liked to follow her brothers around the property, collecting rocks and feathers and whatever else caught her eye. She had a whole collection of treasures in a shoebox under her bed. Bits of quartz, an old railroad spike, a bird skull she found near the barn, and kid stuff. Pretty normal stuff. That's what life was like before that summer. We had a normal, happy family. We had our struggles, of course, like Carol's illness, of course, and the financial pressures of keeping a farm afloat. But we were solid. We loved one another, and we took care of each other. But then I found the bones. There was this acre of land on the northeast corner of our property that I'd been meaning to clear for years. It was overgrown with wild prairie grass and dotted with these stubborn little blackjack oak trees, which had taken root God knows how long ago. My grandfather had used it as a dumping ground of sorts, for old equipment and things, like rusted plows and broken fence posts. There was even a skeleton of a Model T out there, which had been sitting there since before I was born. I'd always meant to clear it out and get it ready for planting, but there was always something more pressing to deal with. That summer, I needed the space. We'd had a wet spring, which was good for the soil, and I figured if I could get that acre cleared and planted by fall, I'd have a solid crop of winter wheat to see us through the next year. Every square foot mattered when you were operating on margins as thin as ours. Not that a single acre would get us through a full year, but you get what I mean. We had to make everything count. So I started clearing it. That was hot, miserable work. Mid-July with temperatures pushing 100 degrees, wind blowing so hard some days that the dust would get in your eyes and your nose and your mouth until you felt like you were breathing through sand. I'd head out there after my morning chores and work till noon. Then I'd come back to check on Carol and the kids, then head out again until supper. It took me about 2 weeks to clear most of the brush and haul away the old equipment. It was on the second to last day that I hit something with my tractor. Now, when you're clearing land that's been neglected for decades, you expect to hit things. Usually rocks or roots or maybe some old fence wire, but it's all part of the job. This felt different. There was a crunch and a grinding sound. Then something caught in the rotary cutter and made the whole tractor shudder before it broke free. I shut the engine off and climbed down to take a look. At first, I thought it was an old branch. The sun was right overhead, and I was squinting against the glare, and all I could make out was something pale and splintered lying in the torn-up earth. I got down on one knee and brushed away some of that dirt. And then I realized what I was looking at. They were bones. In fact, they looked like human bones. I was pretty sure, at least. There were 4 or 5 pieces, some of them broken by the rotary cutter, arranged in a way that made me think they'd once been connected. It looked like an arm, maybe. The longest piece was about 1 foot long and had a joint at one end that looked like it might have been an elbow. The smaller pieces looked like hand bones, though I wasn't certain. They were old. I could tell that much just by looking at them. They had a yellowed, dried-out look that bones tend to get after they've been in the ground for a long time. It had to be decades at least, maybe much longer. I sat there in the dirt for a good few minutes, staring at these bones. I remember the wind picking up then, blowing dust across my face, and I remember thinking that I should probably feel more alarmed than I did. But mostly I just felt confused. How long had these bones been on our property? Who did they even belong to? Had my grandfather known about them? Had his father? Eventually, I got up and walked back to the house to call the sheriff's department. The woman who answered the phone was polite, but not particularly worried. I described what I'd found, and she asked a few questions. These questions were, how old did the bones look? How deep were they buried? Had I noticed anything else unusual in the area? I answered as best I could, and then she put me on hold for a few minutes. When she came back on the line, she told me that a deputy would come out to take a look, but it might be a day or two before anyone was available. In the meantime, she said I should just put the bones aside somewhere safe and try to remember exactly where I'd found them. "You're not worried about this?" I asked. "Sir, we get calls like this more often than you'd think," she explained. "Old farmland and old homesteads. There's all kinds of things buried out there. Most of the time, the bones turn out to be 100 years old or more. Likely Native American remains or pioneer graves. That sort of thing. Unless you've got some reason to believe otherwise, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it." I thanked her and hung up, still feeling unsettled. I went back out to the field, gathered up the bone fragments as carefully as I could, and I put them in an old coffee can. Then I sat the can on a shelf in the barn and went back to work. I finished up my day by late afternoon. By then the heat had broken a little, and there was a nice breeze coming in from the west. I drove the tractor back to the barn and washed up at the spigot. Then I headed inside to check on Carol. Carol was awake when I came in, propped up against the pillows with a book in her lap. She looked tired. She always looked tired during her flare-ups, but she smiled when she saw me. "You smell like a goat," she said. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's exactly what I was going for." "I'm just saying, if you're trying to attract a mate, you might want to reconsider your approach." I sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand. Her fingers were swollen. The joints were fiercely red, but she didn't pull away. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Oh, you know, like I've been hit by a truck, dragged behind it for a few miles, then left in a ditch to contemplate my life choices." She squeezed my hand. "But I'm fine. Oh, look at this. Beverly made me a card." She nodded toward the nightstand, where a piece of construction paper had been folded in half and decorated with crayon flowers. Inside, in Beverly's careful handwriting, it said, "Get well soon, Mom. I love you more than rocks." "More than rocks," I said. "That's high praise coming from her." "I know, right? I'm very honored." Carol shifted against the pillows, wincing a little. "How's the clearing going?" "I'll be finished tomorrow." "Good. I was starting to worry you'd get heat stroke out there." "Truth be told, I almost did, but, I found something interesting." I told her about the bones. She listened closely. "That's strange," she said when I was done. "Have you told the boys?" "Not yet. I didn't want to make a big deal about it." "Probably smart. You know how little Lenny is. He'd be out there digging up the whole field looking for more." I smiled at that. It was true. Lenny had inherited his sister's fascination with treasures not long ago, but his taste ran more toward the macabre. He was always bringing home dead insects or snake skins. One time he even brought home an owl pellet. If he knew about these human bones, they would be right up his alley. "Yeah, the sheriff's department didn't seem too worried about it," I said. "They figure they're old. Pioneer era, maybe earlier." Carol nodded. "Makes sense. This land's been here a lot longer than we have." She was quiet for a moment, and her eyes drifted toward the window. The curtains were open, and I could see the sun getting low over the fields. It was nothing but gold and orange out there now. "Still," she said, "it's sad, isn't it? Someone was buried out there and nobody remembers who they were." Nobody even knew they were there until now. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on the practical questions. Who to call, what to do with human bones, how to get back to work. I hadn't really considered the person the bones belonged to. Someone had lived and died and been laid to rest in that field. And now, decades or maybe centuries later, I'd churned them up with a tractor blade. "Yeah," I said. "I guess it is." We sat together for a while, quiet yet comfortable. Eventually, Carol's eyes started to droop, and I told her to get some rest. I went downstairs to start dinner, and by the time the boys came in from the barn, and Beverly came running in from wherever she'd been exploring, the whole thing had mostly slipped my mind. We ate together, the four of us, crowded around the kitchen table, the way we always did. Kenneth talked about a book he was reading, something about the Civil War, and Lenny complained about having to muck out the horse stalls. Beverly showed me a piece of mica she'd found near the creek, holding it up to the light so I could see the way it sparkled. It was a really good evening, a normal evening. By 10 o'clock, everyone was in bed. Carol had fallen asleep hours earlier, and I'd carried Beverly up to her room after she dozed off on the couch. The boys had gone up on their own, Kenneth with his book and Lenny with his Walkman. I stayed up a while longer, which was also normal for me. I never was good at falling asleep quick. Too many thoughts rattling around in my head. Too many things I should have done differently or still needed to do. I sat in my chair in the living room, listening to the house settle around me, and eventually I felt my eyes getting heavy. I think I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the screaming started. It was a sound I'd never heard before. Not from an animal, not from a person, not from anything. It was high and raw and absolutely terrified, and it was coming from upstairs. I was on my feet before I was fully awake, my hand reaching for my shotgun I kept propped beside the chair. I don't remember running up the stairs, but I do clearly remember chasing after that awful, endless scream. It was coming from Lenny's room. I threw open the door, ready to confront whatever was inside. But there was just Lenny. He was sitting bolt upright in his bed, his eyes squeezed shut, his mouth open, and he was screaming. But that scream hadn't sounded like him. Maybe I just had never heard him scream like that. "Lenny," I grabbed his shoulder and shook him hard. "Lenny, wake up." He didn't open his eyes, but he did keep screaming, his hands clutching the blankets. His whole body was shaking. "Lenny, it's your dad. You're having a nightmare. Wake up." Then, suddenly, he stopped. His mouth closed, and his body went stiff. In a voice I barely recognized, he said, "I'm not asleep." I felt something cold run down my spine. "What?" "I'm not asleep, Dad." His eyes were still squeezed shut, so tight his whole face was scrunched up with effort. "I saw something in my room. It was standing right there, right next to my bed, and I can't look at it again. I can't." "Lenny, there's nothing in here. It's just me, your dad. Look at me." "No," he rapidly shook his head. No, it was a man, Dad, but his face was wrong. It was all bones, but the bones were wrong. They were flat, like they'd been sanded down smooth, like someone had taken a grinder to his face. I didn't see any eyes or nose or mouth, just smooth, flat bone. I stared at him. My son, my 13-year-old son, shaking in his bed, describing something impossible. "Lenny, it was a nightmare," I told him. "Just a nightmare. There's nothing else here with us, Lenny. I promise." He didn't reply to that. He kept his eyes closed, but there were tears leaking out from under his eyelids. I didn't know what else to do. So I set the shotgun down, and I climbed into bed next to him, and I put my arm around his shoulders. He was still shaking. "Hush, I'm right here," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. Just try to go back to sleep, okay? I'll keep an eye out." It took a long time, but his breathing gradually slowed, and eventually his body relaxed against mine. I could feel his heart beating, still too fast, but slowing down, calming. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, telling myself that it had been just a nightmare, a vivid, terrible nightmare, but nothing more. Kids have nightmares all the time. It didn't mean anything. But I couldn't sleep. Something was keeping me awake, some instinct I couldn't name. I lay there listening to Lenny breathe, listening to the wind outside, listening to the old house creak and settle around us. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. A sound coming from the corner of the room, near the closet. A soft and rhythmic sound. Breathing. Something was breathing in the corner of my son's room. I didn't move. I couldn't. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest and my arms still wrapped around my son, listening to that sound. Slow and steady, it breathed in and out, like someone sleeping, someone waiting. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. But then, as gradually as it started, it faded away. The sound grew softer and softer until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then the only sound was Lenny's breathing and the wind outside and the blood rushing through my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, not even a wink. I lay there until dawn, watching the darkness slowly turn to sun up, waiting for that sound to come back. The next morning came slow, and it was overcast. And as I said, I hadn't slept at all. At the first light of morning, I crept slowly away from the bed and went downstairs to start the coffee. I stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the sun try to burn through the clouds, thinking about what I had heard in the dark. That breathing, the slow and patient noise coming from the corner of my son's room. I told myself it had to be nothing, just the house settling and the wind finding its way through a crack in the wall. Maybe after Lenny's strange nightmare, I was a little jumpy. I told myself all these things and I nearly believed it. By the time the kids came down for breakfast, I'd managed to pull myself together. Carol was still sleeping. She'd slept through the whole ordeal, which I was grateful for. She needed her rest, and the last thing she needed was something else to worry about. Kenneth came down first, quiet as usual, and started to set the table without being asked. Then Lenny, looking pale and tired, but otherwise normal. He didn't mention what happened, and I didn't want to bring it up. Beverly came bouncing down last, chattering about something she'd dreamt about. A horse with wings, if I recall. Maybe a dog that could talk. I was having trouble listening. "I need to run into town today, guys," I said as we were finishing up. "Groceries, hardware store. Lenny, Beverly, you're coming with me. Kenneth, I need you to stay here and keep an eye on your mother." Kenneth nodded. He was a good kid, a responsible and dependable kid. I knew I could trust him. "What if she needs something?" he asked. "Just make sure she takes her pills at 10. There's water and crackers on the nightstand. And if anything happens, anything at all, call 911. You know where we'll be. Hardware store first, then Mel's grocery." "Yes, sir," he said. We finished breakfast. I checked on Carol one more time, and then the three of us piled into the truck. As I was climbing into the driver's seat, I hesitated for a second. Then I went back to the barn, and I grabbed the coffee can with the bones in it. At that point in time, I wasn't sure exactly why I brought them yet. Part of it was practical. The sheriff's department had said someone would come out, but no one had yet, and I figured I might as well drop them off myself, save them the time. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite visualize yet. Those bones had been sitting on that shelf in my barn all night, and the thought of leaving them there while we were gone felt strangely wrong, like we were leaving a door unlocked in a bad neighborhood. like we were inviting in trouble. So I put the can on the floor of the passenger side, and we headed into town. The drive was nice and quiet. Linny was staring out the window, not talking, while Beverly played with a doll she'd brought, making it walk across the dashboard. The clouds never did burn off. They just hung there low and heavy, making everything feel close and still. As I had told Kenneth, we hit the hardware store first. I needed to get a new blade for the brush cutter and some fence wire, and while I was there I picked up a new hasp for the barn door, which had been giving me trouble. The whole trip took maybe 20 minutes. Then the grocery store. I let the kids pick out some ice cream, those little cups with the wooden spoons. Then we got everything else on the list Carol had made for me. By the time we were loading the bags into the truck, it was almost noon. "One more stop, guys," I said. "You two wait here. Keep the truck running and keep the cold air on. Got it?" They nodded. I grabbed the coffee can and walked across the street to the sheriff's office. The county sheriff's department was housed in a squat brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated in nearly a century. There was a faded American flag hanging limp by the front door, and a couple of patrol cars parked out front, their engines ticking in the heat. Inside, a woman I didn't recognize was sitting behind the front desk, pecking away at a typewriter, which even then seemed a little outdated. She looked up when I came in. "Help you?" "Yes, ma'am. I called a couple days back about some bones I found on my property. I was told someone would come out and take a look, but nobody showed up. So I figured I'd just bring them in myself." She frowned, glancing down at something on her desk. Then she looked back up at me. "What was your name again?" I told her. She shuffled through some papers, made a little sound, then picked up the phone and spoke quietly to someone on the other end. After a minute, she hung up and gestured toward a row of plastic chairs along the wall. "Deputy Harrison will be with you in a few minutes." I sat down and waited. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough that I could hear it over the hum of the air conditioning. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, a door in the back opened and a heavy-set man in a tan uniform came out. "Mr. Brosnan?" "That's me." "I'm Deputy Harrison. You're the one who found the bones?" "Yes, sir, out on my property, the northeast corner. I called it in a couple days ago." He nodded slowly, looking at the coffee can in my hands. "And you brought them here?" "Well, nobody ever came out to get them, so I figured this would be easier." He took the can from me, opened it, and peered inside. His expression didn't change. "These look old," he said. "That is what the lady on the phone said, but I thought you'd want them anyway for, I don't know, analysis or whatever." Deputy Harrison set the can down on the counter and rubbed the back of his neck. He had the look of a man who was fed up by something else, but here I was. "Here's the thing, Mr. Brosnan. Based on what I'm seeing here, these are almost certainly Native American remains. Pre-statehood, maybe older. And if that is the case, there's a whole process we have to go through. Federal laws, tribal consultation, archaeological assessment. It's not as simple as just handing them over." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. If these bones are what I think they are, we can't just take possession of them without knowing the proper procedures. We would need to get them examined, verified, dated. Then we'd have to contact the relevant tribes. Could be Comanche, could be Kiowa, could be half a dozen others depending on how old they are, and who controlled that territory at the time. It's a whole ordeal." "A whole ordeal," I repeated. "Deputy, I found human bones on my property. I just want to do the right thing here." "And sir, I appreciate that, I do. But the right thing, legally speaking, is a lot more complicated than just dropping them off at the sheriff's office." I could feel my patience starting to fray. I'd been up all night. I was running on coffee and adrenaline. And now this man was telling me that doing the decent thing was going to require some kind of bureaucratic odyssey Fine, I said. What if I just bury them back where I found them, put them back in the ground and say a prayer over them and call it done? Deputy Harrison's expression shifted, became more stern. I would not advise that, Mr. Brosnan. Now that you've removed the remains from where they were found, you've technically taken possession of them. Disposing of human remains improperly is a crime, and it doesn't matter how old they are. So you're telling me I can't give them to you and I can't put them back? Not without going through the proper channels. No. I stood there looking at this man. Then I glanced over to the coffee can on the counter, and I felt something hot and frustrated building in my chest. This is insane, I said. I understand your frustration, sir, I really do. But my hands are tied here. If you want, I can give you a number to call. There's a state office that handles these kinds of situations. They can walk you through the process. I don't have time for a process. I've got a farm to run, a sick wife at home, and 3 kids. Then I guess you've got a decision to make. I grabbed the can off the counter and walked out without another word. The kids looked up when I got back to the truck. Beverly, of course, had ice cream smeared around her mouth, and Lenny was still working on his, scraping the last bits out of the bottom of the cup with his little wooden spoon. Leave it to Lenny to take that long to eat a little cup of ice cream. You still have the bones? Beverly said. Yeah, sweetie, I still have the bones. Even the cops didn't want them, Lenny said. There was something in his voice, something not quite his usual humor, but an attempt at it. He sounded like he was trying to act normal. It's just bureaucratic nonsense, I said, putting the truck into gear. Red tape. Nobody wants to do their job anymore. We pulled out onto the main road and headed home. The clouds had gotten thicker, and the air had that heavy, charged feeling. A storm was coming. I drove a little faster than I should have, still a bit irritated. You know, Lenny said after a while, I heard a story once, back in school a couple years ago, about this area, about what happened here before it was Oklahoma. What kind of story? Messed up stuff. Wars between the settlers and the Indians. He glanced at Beverly, who was looking out the window, not really paying attention. There was this homestead somewhere around here with a family of settlers. I think it was a man and his wife and their kids, kind of like us. One night a war party came through and, well, killed them. I didn't say anything, just kept watching the road. But that wasn't all, Lenny continued. The family, the dead family, well, they had relatives somewhere. Brothers and cousins and something like that. And when they found out what happened, they came looking for revenge. They actually found the war party still at the homestead, still there after a few days. And they did things to them. Bad things. Kept them alive for a long time while they did it. Lenny, I said. I'm just saying there's a lot of history out there. A lot of bad blood soaked into this dirt. I looked at him for a brief moment. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale just like this morning. His eyes looked tired. Son, times were different back then, I said. Horrible different. Everybody did terrible things to everybody else. Settlers to Indians and Indians to settlers. And everyone else caught in between. It was a brutal time, and a lot of innocent people suffered for it. I paused. But that's not how things have to be anymore. We're better now, or at least we're trying to be. Lenny didn't respond. Beverly started to hum something to herself, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. We were maybe half a mile from the house when I saw Kenneth. He was running down the road towards us, waving his arms. And he was running hard, like something was after him. I felt my stomach sink. I slowed down, and he practically threw himself at the driver's side door, grabbing the handle. His face was white with fear. "Dad, something's wrong. You have to come quick." "Kenneth, slow down. What happened?" "It's Mom. There's something in the house with her. I heard these noises and I went to check on her. I was outside at the time, and when I went to the front door, it was locked. I didn't lock it, and it won't open. I couldn't get back in. I tried everything, and I heard someone walking around, and it wasn't Mom." "Get in the truck." He jumped in the back with Linny and Beverly, and I floored it. The engine roared, tires kicking gravel, and we tore up the driveway faster than I'd ever driven on our property before. The house looked normal from the outside. Same white clapboard siding, same wraparound porch, and same everything. But there was something definitely wrong. It was too still, under a darkening sky. I grabbed the shotgun from behind the seat. "Stay here," I told the kids. "All of you, don't move until I come back. Kenneth is in charge." I ran to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. I fumbled for my keys. Then I found the right one and shoved it into the lock. It turned. I felt the bolt slide back. But when I pushed on the door, it didn't budge. Not an inch. It was like trying to push through a concrete wall. What the hell? I threw my shoulder against it then. Nothing. I kicked it as hard as I could, but nothing. Something was blocking it from the inside. Something heavy and immovable. I looked at the window next to the door. It was a single pane of old glass in a wooden frame. For the briefest of seconds, I thought about how much it would cost to replace. But then I thought about Carol, alone in there with God knows who, and I stopped thinking about the window. I flipped the shotgun around, gripping the barrel, and swung the stock as hard as I could. The glass exploded inward. I knocked out the remaining shards with my elbow, hoisting myself up, and climbed through. Inside the house, it was dark, way too dark. All the lights were off, and the clouds outside weren't letting much sun through the windows. I could hear something, a strange low sound that I couldn't quite recognize, though it did remind me of wind through a broken vent, or maybe breathing. I ran to our bedroom. The hallway seemed longer than ever. The shadows seemed thicker. My footsteps echoed off the walls in a way that didn't sound quite right, like the house had grown larger now, hollow and echoing. I rounded the corner into the bedroom and stopped. Carol was there. She was being held up off the bed, her feet dangling 6 inches above the mattress, her head lolled back. And the thing holding her, it was a man, or something shaped like a man. It was dressed in dark clothes, old clothes, fabric that hung in tatters from a frame that was too thin and too long. Its back was to me, one arm extended, hand wrapped around Carol's throat. "Hey!" The thing turned around, and I saw its face. Linny had tried to describe it, but the words couldn't capture what I was looking at. The face was bone, smooth, white bone, but it wasn't a skull. All the features had been ground away. No eye sockets, no nasal cavity, no mouth. Just a flat, inwardly curved surface, like someone had taken a human skull and sanded it down until there was nothing left but a featureless oval. And yet, somehow, I could feel it looking at me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. For that terrible moment, we stared at each other. Then its body disappeared. I don't mean it faded or dissolved. I mean it was instantly gone in a flash. But the clothes, those tattered black rags, they stayed behind, hanging in the air for half a heartbeat, then suddenly shooting sideways, flying across the room toward the window. There, the glass was cracked, just a bit, just a thin line running from corner to corner, and the black fabric squeezed through that crack like smoke being sucked through a vent. impossibly fast, impossibly fluid. At the same moment, the entire house went dark. And I don't mean the mostly already off lights. I mean all of the electricity. Refrigerator, the hallway clock, all of it dead silence now, dead darkness, except for the gray light filtering through the windows. Carol collapsed onto the bed. I was at her side in an instant, my hands on her face, her shoulders, checking her wounds, checking her breath, if there was breath. Carol, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, looked through me almost, and for a second I wasn't sure she knew where she was. I was falling, she said. I dreamed I was falling, but there was no bottom. Just black everywhere, and I could hear screaming. So much screaming. Honey, you're safe now, I said. You're safe, I'm here. But even as I said that, I wasn't sure if it was true. Whatever had been in this room, whatever had its hands around my wife's throat, it was still out there, on our land, and it wasn't finished with us. I didn't wait for an explanation. I didn't wait for anything. As soon as I knew Carol was breathing and okay, I grabbed the coffee can from where I'd left it on the kitchen counter, and I went outside. The clouds had broken by then, and the late afternoon sun was beating down on the fields with that fierce, merciless heat that only Oklahoma can produce. But I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything except that white-hot rage burning in my chest, rage at the thing that had touched my wife, indignation for bringing those bones into our home, rage at the whole damn situation. I got in the truck and I drove out to the northeast field, the acre I still hadn't finished clearing, the spot where I'd found those bones in the first place. I grabbed a shovel from the truck bed and started digging. The ground was hard, baked dry by the summer sun, but I didn't care. I dug like a man possessed, throwing dirt over my shoulder, not stopping until I had a hole about 2 feet deep. Then I upended the coffee can, letting the bones tumble into the earth, and I started to shovel the dirt back in. There, I shouted as I threw in the last shovelful. There! Is that what you want? Is that what this is about? My voice echoed across the empty field. Nothing answered. I stood there for a while, breathing hard. Sweat was dripping down my face by then. I was staring at the patch of disturbed earth before me. If this was some kind of angry spirit, some ghost or revenant, or whatever you want to call it, then maybe putting the bones back would appease it. Maybe it would finally leave us alone. But I wasn't sure. I just didn't know what else to do. I drove back to the house as the sun was setting, the kids still in the truck with me, though they were quiet. Carol was sitting up in bed when I got back. She looked confused, but otherwise unhurt. The kids clustered around her, all 3 of them. They were scared but relieved that Mom was okay. I told them everything was gonna be fine, that I took care of it, but I couldn't help but feel like I was lying. That night was another sleepless night. I didn't even try. I sat in the chair in our bedroom with the door open, shotgun in my lap, watching the dark hallway and listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Carol was asleep beside me. She had taken an extra dose of her pain medication and she drifted off almost immediately. The kids were in their rooms, doors closed, hopefully dreaming of something better than what we lived through that day. From where I sat, I could see down the hallway into the living room. The curtains were open and a little moonlight was filtering in, just enough to make out the shapes of the furniture. The couch, the side table, the old wooden rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. I ended up just staring at that chair for some reason. It was empty, just an old piece of furniture sitting there in the dark. I blinked. When my eyes opened again, there was something in the chair. I felt my whole body go cold. It was just a shape, a dark, hunched shape. But it was facing me. I could feel its attention on me. The rocking chair was completely still. Whatever was sitting in it wasn't moving at all. I blinked again. There was a sound, a rapid skittering sound, like something moving very fast across a hard floor. And when my eyes opened, the chair was empty. But now there was something else. At the end of the hallway, maybe a yard from where I sat, a piece of black cloth was trailing across the floor. It led from the hallway into the bathroom, disappearing around the corner of the doorframe. I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain couldn't process it. It was just a cloth, just fabric lying there on the floor like someone had dropped a piece of clothing. Then I looked up. At the very top of the bathroom doorway, 8 feet off the ground, pressed against the ceiling, there was a face looking down at me. Smooth, white, featureless. That flat, terrible expanse of bone, tilted at an angle that no human head should be able to achieve, staring down at me from the dark. I shouted something. I don't remember what, and I brought up the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed hallway. The muzzle flash lit up the entire house for one blinding instant, and in that flash I saw the face clearly, saw the texture of bone, and the way it seemed to drink in the light. Then it was gone. Just gone. The cloth on the floor, the figure in the doorway, all of it vanished like it had never been there. But the house erupted. Carol was screaming, the kids were screaming, doors were flying open. Kenneth came running down the hallway with a baseball bat. Lenny was right behind him. Beverly was crying somewhere in the dark. "Dad, what happened?" I couldn't answer. I was staring at the bathroom doorway still, at that empty space where the face had been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Kenneth took the shotgun from my hands, and I didn't resist. "Dad, you've got to get some sleep," he said. He calmed himself down, then said, "You've been up for 2 days. You're starting to see things." "I'm not seeing things." Maybe not, but you're no good to any of us if you collapse." He looked at his brother. "Lenny, help me get him to bed. We'll take shifts and watch the house." I wanted to say I was fine, but I was actually proud. Kenneth was taking charge. And the truth was, he was right. I was running on fumes. My hands were weak, my vision was blurred, and every shadow in that hallway looked like it was moving. They let me back into the bedroom, set me down next to Carol, and took the shotgun. Kenneth stationed himself in the doorway while Lenny gathered up Beverly and brought her into the room with us. We all stayed together that night. Carol and Beverly in the bed, me in the chair and Lenny on the floor with Kenneth standing guard. I'm not sure when I fell asleep. I remember dreading the idea of seeing the damage I'd done with my shotgun in our own home the next morning. I remember closing my eyes and then I opened them, and morning light was streaming through the windows. Nothing had happened. The rest of the night had passed without incident. But I knew it wasn't over. That day I made some calls after patching up the hole in my ceiling, grateful that I hadn't punctured any plumbing. I wasn't sure who to contact, knowing the police would be useless. So I started with the library in town, then the historical society, anyone else I could think of who might know something about the history of our land. By mid-morning, I'd been put in touch with a woman named Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a historian at the University of Oklahoma, who specialized in Native American history and early settler conflicts in the territory. She agreed to come out that afternoon. She was a small woman, maybe 50, with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She walked the property with me, asking me questions about what I'd found and where I'd found it, then listened carefully as I described everything that had happened since. When I finished, I expected her to call me crazy or to roll her eyes. She said, "The story your son told you in the truck, the one about the Homestead Massacre. Do you remember more details?" "Some of them. A settler family was killed by a war party who overstayed their welcome. Then relatives came back and took revenge." Dr. Whitehorse nodded slowly. "That story is more than just a story. It happened. And it happened here, on this exact piece of land." My heart skipped a beat. "The Harmon family," she continued. "They established a homestead here in 1872. Father, mother, 3 children, exactly like your family. In the spring of 1873, a Comanche raiding party came through. The family was killed, all of them. And the revenge? Somehow someone saw what happened, and the Harmon's relatives caught wind. They had family in Kansas, brothers and cousins. When they heard what happened, they came down with about a dozen men. The raiding party was still in the area. They'd been using the homestead as a temporary camp, which is actually unlike them. The Harmons ambushed them." She paused. "What they did to those men, it's not something I like to talk about, but they kept them alive for days, tortured them in ways I won't describe. When they were finally done, they burned the bodies, burned them completely down to cinders. They wanted to make sure there was nothing left, nothing that could be buried, nothing that could be honored." "But what about the bones I found?" "They aren't Native American. They can't be. The Comanche remains were destroyed completely." Dr. Whitehorse looked at me with something like sympathy in her eyes. "The bones you found belong to the Harmon family, these settlers who were killed here." "But why would they?" I stopped. I didn't know how to finish the question. "The manner of their deaths," Dr. Whitehorse explained. "It was brutal, even by the standards of that time. The raiding party, they dragged some of the family members behind horses, face down, across the prairie." I stared at her. "You understand what that means," she continued. "The ground here is very hard, rocky in places. Being dragged face down across it at speed for hours at a time." She trailed off. "Some of the bodies were never recovered because there wasn't enough left to recover. The flesh and bone had been worn away, sanded down to nothing." That smooth, featureless face appeared in my mind. The flat expanse of bone where features should have been. "What can I do?" I asked. "The Harmon family was buried at a cemetery about 2 hours north of here. The ones they could find, anyway, and future members. It's a small place, mostly forgotten now, but it still exists. If my hunch is correct and those bones belong to one of the family members who was never recovered," she hesitated, "they should be with their family. They've been alone out here for over 100 years. Can you find out where exactly the cemetery is?" "I can make some calls. I should have some information for you by noon tomorrow." Good, I thought. One more night. I just had to get through one more night. That evening, I gathered the family together and told them what I'd learned. Carol was out of bed by then, still weak but insisting on being a part of what came next. The kids listened with wide eyes as I explained about the Harmon family, about what happened on this land, and about why I needed to dig up those bones one more time. "Tomorrow," I said. "First thing in the morning, we dig up those bones. Then we take a little trip and put them where they belong." I stayed up again that night. I knew I should sleep, God knows I needed it, but I couldn't. Not with what I knew now, not with that thing still anywhere. The hours crawled by. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2. I walked the hallway, checking on the boys, then circling back to check on Beverly. Her door was open. I'd left it that way on purpose, so I could see her from the hall. But in that moment, when I looked in, something was wrong. The window above her bed was open. The curtains were blowing in the night breeze, and Beverly was being pulled through the window. She was upside down, her hair hanging toward the floor, and her small body was halfway out into the darkness. Something had her by the ankles and was dragging her through, and she was wide awake. Her eyes were open, her mouth was open, but she wasn't screaming. She was too scared to make a sound. Her eyes locked onto mine, pleading for help. And then, with one yank, she disappeared. I crossed that room in a second, and I jumped through the window. I was outside in the dark, my bare feet hitting the hard ground, and my eyes straining to see anything in the moonless night. I could hear something ahead of me, a dragging sound, something being pulled across the dirt. I ran as fast as my heart would let me. It was overwhelmingly dark that night. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could hear her. I could hear that dragging sound, and I followed it. Moments later, I could no longer hear it. I stopped, gasping for air, turning in circles, trying to figure out where I was. The field. I was in the northeast field, the acre I still needed to clear. There was a scream. I sprinted toward the sound, and I found her. Beverly was lying face down in the dirt. She'd been flipped over at some point during the drag, and her face and arms were pressed into the hard ground. She was scraped up, cuts on her cheeks, on her hands, on her knees, blood mixed with dirt. I fell to my knees beside her and picked her up. "I'm so sorry," I said. The words came out broken and choked. I was crying too. I hadn't even realized it until then. I'd been crying for some time. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should have protected you. I should have..." She buried her face in my chest and sobbed. I carried her back to the house. I don't know how long it took, but it felt like hours. When we got there, Carol was standing on the porch, her face terrified and worried, and the boys were behind her. We all went to the master bedroom, all 5 of us. We stayed there together, huddled on the bed, waiting for dawn. Beverly was okay. Scuffed up, dirty, but okay. When the sun finally came up, we went out to the field as a family. I dug up the bones while the kids watched. It only took a few minutes. I hadn't buried them very deep. I put them back in the coffee can, put the can in the truck, and we all piled in together. We drove into town. We got hamburgers and more ice cream. We sat in a booth at the diner and pretended everything was fine. We were just a regular family having a regular day. The kids even laughed, and that made all the difference. At noon, I found a payphone, and I called Dr. Whitehorse. "Oh, hi. I tried to reach you this morning, but you didn't seem to be home." "No, sorry about that. We weren't home. Do you have the information?" She gave me the exact name and location of the cemetery. It was about 2 hours north, just like she'd said. A small family plot, mostly abandoned now, but still maintained by the county. She said, You should contact the caretakers, or see if any of the Harmon descendants still live there. There's a proper way to do this." Again, with the proper way. I told her, "Yes, ma'am. I appreciate your help." Then I hung up and went back to the truck. We drove north for almost 2 hours. The cemetery was exactly where she said it would be, a small fenced-in plot on a hill overlooking a creek. There were maybe 20 headstones, most of them weathered and worn out, the names barely legible anymore. I found the Harmon section near the back. Father, mother, 2 of the 3 children. There was an empty space next to them, overgrown with grass. I did not contact the caretakers. I did not look for descendants. I found a spot where the ground was soft, dug a hole with my hands, and put the bones inside. "Rest now," I said quietly. "You're home." We drove back in silence. By the time we got to the farm, the sun was setting and the sky was orange and red. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was quiet. No breathing in corners, no figures in the dark, no smooth, featureless faces staring down from doorways. It was over. Life went on. Carol eventually got better, not cured, but better. The kids grew up, went to college, and they got families of their own. Kenneth's a lawyer now, and I couldn't be more proud. Lenny teaches high school history, which I find very fitting. Beverly's a nurse, and she's got 2 kids. We never talked much about that summer after it happened. It was too painful and too strange. But I still think about it. Usually late at night, when the house is quiet, I think about that poor soul who spent over a century alone in the dirt, lost and forgotten, their face ground away to nothing by the cruelty of men. I think about what they must have suffered, and I think about how all they wanted was to go home to their family. I'm grateful. That's the word I keep coming back to, grateful. Because that summer, I faced something I could not explain that could have destroyed my whole family, and against all odds, it was a problem that I could actually solve. Not every problem is like that. Not every darkness can be driven away by doing the right thing. But this one could, and I thank God for that every single day. I want to end this episode by wishing all of you a very Merry Christmas. This is a pretty good story for the holidays in a way. Wholesome, happy ending, and scary enough to get you through the family get-togethers. It's easily one of my recent favorites. This has been Tales from the Break Room, a podcast where I read scary work-related stories, and you can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. I'll be back soon, maybe with one more story before the new year. Till then, I'll be clocking out, so take care.